like to welcome everyone to the opening plenary of the 18th Platypus International Convention, Marxism and the Fate of the American Revolution. The Platypus-affiliated society, established in December 2006, organizes reading groups, public fora, research, and journalism focused on the problems and tasks inherited from the old 1920s to 30s, new 1960s to 70s, and post-political 1980s to 90s left for the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. Today's panel, as well as many of our other events, is being hosted by our chapter at Northwestern. If you would like to find out more about Northwestern Platypus, you can talk to Ben Katz, who's over there. Platypus at Northwestern runs a reading group on Sundays from 12 to 3 in Kreska 2329, and a coffee break Fridays 4 to 6 at Norris, Buendia, in front of the Buendia. And it also hosts more events like this, so get in touch with them to find out about that. My name is Erin Haygood, and I will be moderating tonight's panel. The opening plenary is titled "The Crisis of the American Revolution." Following the re-election of Lincoln as president, Marx wrote to the American people, quote, "From the commencement of the titanic American strife, the working men of Europe felt instinctively that the star-spangled banner carried the destiny of their class. In America, the idea of one great democratic republic had first sprung up, whence the first Declaration of the Rights of Man was issued, and the first impulse given to the European Revolution of the 18th century. Given the seismic policies of Trump's second term, we ask, does the American Revolution persist today? What is or was the American Revolution? How does it inform the conditions of possibility for the left in the present? What tasks, if any, does the left inherit from the American Revolution? And do we need new interpretations of the American Revolution?" So joining us to answer this question, we have three speakers whom I will introduce in the order in which they will speak. They will give us approximately 15 minutes of opening remarks, followed by a short round of discussion, and then we will open up for the Q&A. So on the far end of the table from me is Edith Fischer. Edith Fischer is a Marxist. Having joined the socialist youth movement as a high school student and been educated in the Marxism of Trotsky and Ernst Mandel, she has spent the subsequent decade and change in the ranks of the socialist movement. She is a founding member of the Revolutionary Communist Organization, now known as Communist Unity. In the center is Chris Catron. Chris Catron teaches Marxist critical theory at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and the Institute for Clinical Social Work, and is the original lead organizer and chief pedagogue of the Platypus-affiliated society and the original organizer of the Campaign for a Socialist Party. And finally, directly to my side is Ingar Solty. Ingar Solty is senior research fellow at the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung in Berlin and author of numerous books, including Trump's Triumph, Post-Liberal Capitalism, and the edition Marxismen, a 36-volume book series of introductions to key Marxist thinkers from Marx to Anwar Shaikh. Okay, with that, I will hand it over to Edith.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everybody. Forgive me, I'm going to speak mostly from notes. And I'm not an American. And so I'm, somewhat offering an outside perspective on the question of the American Revolution. I think that is going to, in part of my point, that the fate of the American Revolution is indeed the fate of the world revolution. So the American Revolution today has few friends and many enemies. On the right, you have a sort of illiberal trend which opposes in deed, if not usually in word, the fundamental pillars of the American Republic. just the other day when we were here, we had some friends from the the American Foundation for Tradition, Family and Property, sort of marching around the campus with their little red capes and bagpipes and such. And those guys, I went and read their manifesto because I find these people fascinating, and they believe that the current sickness in civilization goes all the way back to before the Protestant Reformation, and that talk about repealing the 20th century, they want to repeal the 14th century, and with that in mind, I think that it's pretty fair to say that many on the right, but talk about people less marginal than that, the current trends on the right to oppose things like birthright citizenship, to oppose freedom of the press and freedom of speech, to call for open repression of political dissidents, to oppose these are attacks on the fundamental elements, or an attack on, obviously, the separation of church and state, an enormous part of the American Revolution. So, on the left, largely hostile to the political legacy of the American Revolution. There's a few different versions of this, and I'm sure that other people will talk about it, and others talk about it in more detail, but I think it's fair to say that the American left today is not overly fond of the American Revolution. And in the mainstream of society, American society, the American Revolution is elevated to a form of civic religion, based around the Thermidorian Constitution, which elevates the revolution to myth while eliding many of its most revolutionary elements. So, with that in mind, it's necessary to place the American Revolution in the proper historical context, which, in my understanding, is the world historical transition from feudal society to capitalist society, or pre-capitalist society to capitalist society, and from the ancien regime to bourgeois civilization. This transition is marked by what our friends in the, Institute to Defend Family and Property, or whatever it's call the revolution, which I'll use that term as well because I like it. This revolution has an economic component, so obviously the abolition of serfdom in Western Europe, the spread of commercial capitalism, and the first, second, and third industrial revolutions. Has a scientific dimension, Copernican, Darwinian, chemical, and then I would argue also revolutions in physics, and also Freudian and Marxist sociological all constitute part of the bourgeois scientific revolution. Has a political element, beginning with the Reformation, well actually before the Reformation, with the Dutch Revolt, the Reformation, the Dutch Revolt, the English Revolution, the American, French, Haitian, Bolivarian revolutions in South America, the struggle for independence of various countries, etc. The American Revolution is part of a global cycle of revolutions that begins before, arguably, the Protestant Reformation, and arguably ends with the last great bourgeois revolution, which I would argue is the Xinhai Revolution in China, which brought down the Qing dynasty. And in that time, the American Revolution, which is part of this global cycle of revolutions, and should be situated in that as a global phenomenon, has passed through periods of retreat and advance. The Thermidorian Constitution, which birthed what Dan Lazare has called a conservative republic, a republican monarchy of the Montesquieu type, one could say. Itself was a Thermidorian document posed on the edge between revolution and counter-revolution. The failure and then you have the second revolution, or the continuation of the first revolution. It's kind of technical, but the second revolution in the form of the great struggle for the abolition of slavery and to remake the American Republic as a centralized republic, political revolution as well as a social revolution, but which is then hampered by the defeat of radical Reconstruction. And in turn then, in the 20th century, you have the second Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Movement, which in turn hits its own historical limits. So this is the kind of long trajectory of the American Revolution. And its motions, its historical motion, is part of a world historical dialectic of the transition from pre-capitalist to capitalist society, from the ancien regime to bourgeois civilization. But in the course of that revolution, the bourgeois historical project exhausts itself. The dynamic of combined and uneven development and the general exhaustion of the capitalist mode of production as a productive force for the transformation of human civilization has been brought to a halt by the objective limitations of capitalist development and the dynamics of combined and uneven development that cannot mean that the bourgeois revolutions cannot be objectively completed within the system of bourgeois society. This gives birth towards the great contradictions of capitalist civilization. On one hand, you have the trend towards massification, bourgeois freedom and equality, universal flattening, etc., this idea that all social classes dissolve down into the great classes of capital and labor, and they face each other across this great Gaia. While on the other hand, you see capitalist society has a trend towards stratification, segmentation and atomization of those same classes. The reorganization of the working class in the 20th century through the socialization of the wage relation, the segmentation of the labor market, the emergence of the divisions within the world economy around imperialism, around trade, around skill, divisions of the family system, etc. All of these are trends towards stratification, which capitalist society is not simply liquefied, but rather liquefied and then reconstructed and liquefied again. So today we have passed, I would argue, out of the epoch of bourgeois revolutions and into the epoch of proletarian revolutions. Sorry, I'm quite thirsty. This transition, while not successful anywhere, has been particularly deformed, I would argue, in the United States. For a variety of historical reasons, the United States has failed to give birth to even a labor party, let alone a revolutionary Marxist party. This transition has been largely because of the particular peculiarities of the American social formation, the particular character of your bourgeois revolution, and then the sedimented, I think is Mike Davis's term, sedimented historical failures of the American working class to break from the bourgeoisie. And this sedimented historical failure means that each additional wave of struggle faces more limits. Today, the task remains the forging of a political instrument that fits the task of making an American revolution in the epoch of mass capitalist politics. Just like the first cycle of revolution, this coming revolution will be international in character. In fact, it will be even more internationalist, for it will reflect the internationalization of the capitalist system. The petit bourgeois sentimental internationalism of the bourgeois revolutions must be replaced with a thoroughgoing proletarian internationalism, a political and organizational internationalism. This next American revolution, on which I do believe the hinge of world history still turns, which is certainly what Marx and Lenin believed, will be a hemispheric revolution that completes and negates the previous revolutionary tradition. It will sweep aside the Thermidorian constitution, overthrow the oligarchy, and complete the task of modernization and secularization. It will found a radically democratic republic, which will extend from the Arctic to Tierra del Fuego, from the Amazon to the Yukon, that unites hundreds of millions beneath a single democratic state. It will finish the Civil War and Reconstruction, overcome the systematic racial oppression that dominates this country, and achieve democratic self-determination of nationalities and the emancipation of women. And with the working class in power, this new American republic will carry the banner of liberty at the forefront of the workers of the world and prepare for the coming of communism. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
All right, the title of my talk is Why Marxists Loved America. Hegel made an exception to his philosophy of history for America as a land of the future. He acknowledged to a friend that his model political regime of constitutional monarchy, on the basis of the English Revolution, was improved in the American constitutional republic as the ideal form of state for bourgeois civil society. with its elected monarchy and the presidency, as counterbalance to democracy to preserve the freedom of civil society. Marx and Engels regarded the United States as the most bourgeois, democratic, and free country of their time. Lenin called the American Revolution a truly revolutionary war and wrote in the early 20th century that in America, freedom was most complete. For their part, Marxist-informed socialists in the United States, such as the Socialist Party leader Eugene Debs, claimed both the American Revolution and the Civil War and their political leaders as historical figures, such as Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln, to their cause and as their rightful legacy as against the capitalist political parties, the Republicans and Democrats, falsely wearing their mantles. Russian revolutionary Vladimir Lenin greatly esteemed Debs, especially for his denunciation of US imperialism and its involvement in World War I, which had landed Debs in jail. And Debs returned the praise, calling himself during the counter-revolutionary reactionary panic after the Russian Revolution and Woodrow Wilson's Palmer Raid's repression of the Socialist Party, quote, "from head to foot, a Bolshevik and proud of it." Later, Frankfurt School critical theorist Theodor Adorno, who fled the Nazis to the United States, along with his colleagues Max Horkheimer and Herbert Marcuse, among others, wrote endearingly about his experience of American society and upheld the American Republic's constitutional separation of powers and checks and balances as the model for critique. The free interplay of theory and practice and subject and object in maintaining and promoting the freedom of society. So powerful was the influence of the American Revolution that the Communist Party in the United States named its party night school for workers after Thomas Jefferson. Its leader in the 1930s, Earl Browder, famously stated that communism is as American as apple pie. What was the substance of this evaluation by such prominent Marxists of the United States and the American Revolution and its legacy? Marxism understood capitalism as a phenomenon based on bourgeois society and regarded the American Revolution as a bourgeois revolution. What did this mean? First, we must step back and examine the Marxist understanding of history and how it had led to capitalism. The basic idea is that the rise of modern bourgeois society or civil society was a societal transformation on the same order of magnitude as the Neolithic agricultural revolution, which in Marxist terms had ushered in class society from the original primitive communism of Paleolithic hunter-gatherer communities. This was understood as the beginnings of capitalism. The Industrial Revolution was regarded as the crisis of bourgeois society and capitalism, indicated by the class division into capitalists and workers, specifically the proletarianization of labor, in which workers no longer owned the means of production, the machines and other capital goods owned by the capitalist class. The Industrial Revolution, according to Marxism, led to the possibility and necessity of socialism, or modern communism. The Industrial Revolution historically brought about the modern class struggle of the workers against the capitalists that led to socialism. Capitalism, arising as such in the 19th century, was the contradiction and crisis of bourgeois society in the Industrial Revolution, in which a dynamic of replacing labor by automation introduced the business cycle of boom and bust, not merely a commercial crisis of supply and demand and market adjustments, but a crisis of value and wage labor in the social system of production, indicating its potential obsolescence. The French Revolution was closely associated with the American Revolution, which itself was a further development of the English Revolution of the preceding century. The French Enlightenment and the revolutionaries it inspired were noted Anglophiles, and it was not mere coincidence that the storming of the Bastille took place in the centenary year of the seating of the constitutional monarch in the English Glorious Revolution, 1689, as politically theorized by John Locke. Marx said that of the two traditions of materialism, those of Descartes and Locke, it was Locke's that led to socialism. Thomas Jefferson participated in both the American and French revolutions, co-writing the American Declaration of Independence, as well as the French Declaration of the Rights of Human Being and Citizen, co-written by Lafayette, who himself had led the French forces in the American Revolutionary War. The later leading French utopian socialist Saint-Simon served as a soldier in the Revolutionary War under Lafayette and wrote of the indelible experience of freedom he had in America. The American Revolution is best understood as the continuation and radicalization of the English Revolution, as expressed by Benjamin Franklin and Jefferson's revising of Locke's inalienable rights of life, liberty, and property to the pursuit of happiness, of which property was the mere means and not a right as an end in itself. This prepared the United States for the social freedom that made it Hegel's land of the future to be realized in the 19th century, contemporaneous with the rise of Marxism. British utopian socialist Robert Owen presented his model community ideas to the US Congress, meeting with founding fathers and former presidents John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, also James Madison, as a keenly interested audience. One of the final expressions of Jefferson's political sentiments was to endorse, in an 1825 letter to Francis Wright, the utopian socialist experiments underway as a means for facilitating emancipation and abolition as part of the greater cause of labor. The Second Industrial Revolution is conventionally dated from 1871 to 1914, from the Franco-Prussian War to World War I. German victory over France led to unification under the Prussian Empire, which allowed for its rapid industrialization. Contemporaneously, the Meiji Restoration in Japan and political centralization under the emperor, triumphant over the samurai, and the victory of the Union in the American Civil War and the abolition of slavery, as well as the emancipation of the serfs in the Russian Empire, meant that these countries saw rapid industrialization in this period. The rise of these new industrial powers produced new international conflicts in global capitalism and eventually the world wars of the 20th century. Whereas Marx and Engels were individuals in a party of two whose ideas about capitalism and socialism were relatively limited in their influence, in the era of the Second Industrial Revolution, there was the emergence of Marxism as a predominant ideology in the modern proletarian socialist movement of the working class. The new socialist parties most influenced by Marxism in the era prior to World War I were those in Germany, the United States, Russia, Italy, and a very small party in Japan. The countries of the Second as opposed to the First Industrial Revolution. Unlike the others, the United States was a liberal, democratic, constitutional republic. It was also quickly emerging as by far the largest and most dynamic and technically innovative capitalist economy in the world. The Marxists of the Second International, such as Lenin and Eugene Debs, understood that the future of socialism at a world scale would be ultimately decided in America. As elsewhere, the contradiction between bourgeois society and its values of the rights and freedom of labor with the new industrial capitalism was clearly manifest. This introduced a complex dynamic in which the struggle for socialism of the industrial proletariat was connected with upholding the older revolutionary tradition of the American and French revolutions and the bourgeois rights enshrined therein. Just as French socialism emerged from the revolutionary tradition there, so did socialism in the United States through both the American Revolution and the Civil War. In Germany, the preeminent country of the Marxist-led socialist movement at the turn of the 20th century, the working class claimed the legacy of German idealist philosophy of Kant and Hegel, which was itself inspired by the English, American, and French revolutions, as against the capitalists. The working class claimed the intellectual and cultural heritage of the bourgeois revolution that had decayed or become decadent under capitalism. This was also true in England, France, and America. In this way, the struggle for proletarian socialism took up the mantle of the earlier bourgeois revolution and emancipation that had been betrayed in capitalism. So it is not a simple matter of proletarian socialism succeeding the bourgeois revolution in terms of leaving it behind, but of actively recovering it, struggling within the revolutionary tradition from its contradiction in capitalism. Propagandistically, this was posed as the succession of the bourgeoisie by the proletariat as the historically revolutionary and universal class. What did this express? The universality of the bourgeois revolution suffered some severe setbacks outside the United States in the 19th and 20th centuries, as well as at home with the reinvigoration of slavery as a function of the Industrial Revolution, preventing it from dying out naturally as the Founding Fathers expected. Whereas there had been one American republic from the Revolution, one continuous American republic from the Revolution to today, however modified substantially by the Civil War and Reconstruction amendments, France, for example, is today in its fifth republic, interrupted by two monarchies, two empires, and a fascist regime. And the UK remains a monarchy, albeit constitutional, even though it was a republic during its revolutionary civil war in the 17th century, and Germany and Japan had been liberal democracies only since World War II. And the US remains the preeminent capitalist country in the world that it became during the Second Industrial Revolution. The modern bourgeois republic differs from the ancient republic in its respect for civil liberties and rights, the rights of civil society against the state, not observed by ancient democracy. The Marxist understanding of the dialectical relation between capitalism and the possibility and task of socialism means that the contradiction of bourgeois social relations and industrial forces of production poses itself most purely in the United States of America, and has done so since early on. Just as in Marx and Lenin's times, the specter of socialism or communism apparently still haunts the world, as seen in the last millennial generation's attempted resuscitation of its tradition. Today it appears as the ghost of Marxism. The greatest phenomenon of a new socialist movement in recent times has taken place in the United States, with the millennial left. In it, questions of original or historical Marxism, the recovery of Marx and figures such as Lenin, have figured prominently. This is also true in the last major historical upsurge of interest in Marxism in the 1960s New Left, which back then, as now, was influential and inspirational throughout the world. It was long understood that if Marxism is not relevant in the United States, then it is irrelevant everywhere else. Late doubts about the speculative proposition of identical fates of the bourgeois revolution, and America as its last standing avatar, with the struggle for socialism to overcome capitalism, reflect not enlightenment, but its forgetting. Socialist counter-identification with America as the predominant capitalist country expresses doubts about socialism. Marx's and historical Marxism's clear perspectives on the foundational character of the American Revolution and central character of the United States historically in the struggle for socialism have become obscured in the present. A reactionary anti-capitalism, both on the ostensible left and the avowed right, has made a casualty of America and its revolutionary history. In its 250th year, this is particularly poignant. In the recent era of neoliberalism, the Reagan and Thatcher revolution of neoliberal capitalism, the American left has reached to post-World War II European social democracy as a contrasting countermodel, and capitalism has been hastily identified with Anglo-Americanism. In this, both the counter-revolutionary character of social democracy and the revolutionary character of capitalism itself have been obscured. What was forgotten is that original historical Marxism opposed the welfare state of capitalism, which was seen rightly as intentionally undercutting the workers' own social capacities and struggles by making them dependent wards of capitalist politics. Instead, this counterfeiting of socialism has been accepted falsely as good coin. The millennial left, for instance, the Democratic Socialists of America, has been content to accept what the right denounces demagogically as socialism in the welfare state, and inverting its value positively as their own program. The original meaning of not only Marxism, but socialism itself, as the promised self-overcoming and transcendence of capitalism, has been deranged beyond recognition. Worse still, freedom has become a strangely tabooed concept, both on the left and beyond. Pessimism about America expresses pessimism about socialism. It is pessimism about freedom. Choosing the pessimistic version of capitalism in progressive welfarism has meant doubting the possibility of socialism that Marxism originally recognized in capitalism as a self-contradictory form of freedom. The crossroads of socialism or barbarism has cut through the heart of America as the preeminent capitalist country for the last 2 centuries. It still does. Hence, so does Marxism, indelibly. As we remember the American Revolution and its historical legacy, we are haunted by the remaining task of socialism, to realize the historic promise of freedom as the dialectical truth of capitalism. The truly emancipatory character of the American Revolution lives, however contradictorily, in capitalism, and its fate will be determined in the struggle for socialism.
First of all, thank you to Platypus for inviting. Is it on? Okay. Well, first of all, thank you to Platypus for inviting me from Germany. I think there's a certain irony that you invited someone from Germany, the country with no successful revolution, but plenty of counter-revolution with atrocious effects around the world. This is the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, but we're also in the year that marks the 200th anniversary of Wilhelm Liebknecht, who was considered to be Marx's agent in Germany, was deemed a soldier of revolution, and in 1847 he sought to go to the United States to form an agrarian commune in Wisconsin, having the failure of Owen's approach in mind. And in 1887 he traveled to the United States finally, after having been absorbed by the 1848 revolution and everything that followed since. And he said, well, the Americans are like children who maintain their curiosity for knowledge and the world. We Europeans like to remain in the dark. And maybe we're still at that point. Because like Chris mentioned that there's at least a millennial left here. We have a millennial right in the whole of Europe. It's true though. Since the victory of counter-revolution with ground zero having been Greece in January to July 2015, ever since then the far right has been on the upsurge and the left has been in decline. Nevertheless, it is best fought when with the back against the wall, and so I'm happy to contribute something about revolution and the legacy of the American Revolution in light of the World Revolution, as Edith has called it. Historically, I agree the bourgeoisie was a revolutionary force. Its 17th to early 19th century revolutions were a force of progress, enlightenment, and emancipation. As such, they were also welcomed by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, and Georg Lukács was correct to emphasize the liberating nature, especially of the late 18th century Enlightenment classics in literature, as well as the early humanist bourgeois realism of the first half of the 19th century. The American Revolution of 1776 was a cornerstone of bourgeois revolution, the initial spark of an era. It also inspired the great French Revolution of 1789, which gave birth to what Eric Hobsbawm deemed the Age of Revolution that lasted until 1848. The French experience in particular then embodied the formula of revolution also for the socialist ones. The American Revolution was also strikingly different when compared to the long-stretched English one from 1642 to 1688. The English, which gave birth to capitalism, led to the amalgamation of the new urban industrial bourgeoisie with the landowning gentry in the countryside as a force of double oppression towering above the working class. At the same time, the English, American, and French revolutions already started to reveal the contradictions of bourgeois rule. They did so in three ways. First, they showcased the sharp differences between the emergent bourgeoisie and the popular classes. Second, they became visible in the exclusion of women from the status of citizenship. And thirdly, they showed liberalism's limitations in the guise of colonial oppression and the emergence of what Domenico Losurdo has called master race democracy. These contradictions showed as early as the American Revolution itself, even if it was an anti-colonial revolution that facilitated also the emergence of a particular American capitalist imperialism in its modern form as an empire without colonies. And as early as the French Revolution, which immediately inspired the Haitian Revolution as the earliest anti-colonial revolt against master race democracy, the triple exclusion of the propertyless, women, and the colonized lay at the heart of the specificity of liberalism as an explicitly anti-democratic form of elite rule of the propertied classes. Later on in continental Europe, in the middle of the 19th century, the bourgeoisie ceased to be a revolutionary force for good and became a force of counter-revolution. Edith mentioned the exhaustion of bourgeois revolutions and how it was passed on, the legacy of emancipation from the bourgeoisie to the proletariat. Marx analyzed this in his historical political writings, with which he tried to prove the epistemological superiority of the method of historical materialism vis-à-vis the liberal follies such as the great man or coincidental or circular theories of history. The German Marxist sociologist Leo Kofler spoke of the liberal bourgeoisie's conservative turn of 1848. All Europe-wide revolutions of that year were crushed once the proletariat emerged on the stage of history. Conservative turn meant the European-wide amalgamation of the liberal bourgeoisie and the conservative land-owning classes. This also had cultural effects, even though he largely erred during the 1930s expressionism controversy. Lukács was correct in identifying the growth of irrationalism as the dominant trend of bourgeois thought ever since. When we speak of the American and entire age of revolution, then we must also acknowledge that every revolution goes through phases. Each one depends on the mobilization of the popular classes and may only be victorious through them. It therefore contains a democratic moment. Also, the American Revolution was confronted with the popular classes and their demands reaching beyond the limited goals of a bourgeois revolution. Revolutions therefore usually radicalize and give birth to counter-revolutions. In the American Revolution, the propertied classes' conservative turn already happened during the revolution itself. It manifests itself in the very process of the founding fathers drafting the Constitution. The revolutionary masses were largely demobilized, the democratic moment subsided. The class composition of owners entailed that the Constitution was largely written according to their interests. As Charles Beard writes in his economic interpretation of the Constitution of the United States, the Constitution was, quote, carried through principally by four groups of personality interests: money, public securities, manufacturers, and trade and shipping. A large propertyless mass was, under the prevailing suffrage qualifications, excluded at the outset from participation. The Constitution was essentially an economic document based upon the concept that the fundamental private rights of property are anterior to government and morally beyond the reach of popular majorities. In other words, it was the first moment in history of what Stephen Gill called the constitutionalization of inequality. It is no coincidence, I think, that Friedrich August Hayek, the key ideologue of the neoliberal counter-revolution, based his idea of a new constitutionalism of disciplinary neoliberalism on the US Constitution and later US experience of having both universal suffrage and capitalist class domination at the same time, i.e. solving the problem of the working class majority from the standpoint of a minoritarian bourgeoisie in ways different from European immediate fascist dictatorships. In this way, the neoliberals like Hayek and the American James Buchanan were much superior to Carl Schmitt and even Ludwig von Mises, Hayek's teacher, who had hailed fascism as the savior of civilization. American constitutionalization was thus a counter-revolution, and the various popular uprisings against it, such as Shays' Rebellion in 1786, 1787 Massachusetts, show it. It was Terry Boughton who in 2007 showed in Taming Democracy, in what he calls the troubled ending of the American Revolution, that perceptions according to which the revolution made, quote, the interests and prosperity of ordinary people, their pursuits of happiness, the goal of society and government, were ideological. Ordinary people, according to Boughton, were rather, quote, convinced that the revolutionary elite had waged and won a counter-revolution against popular democratic ideals. During the 1780s and 1790s, ordinary folk across the new nation perceived democracy to be under assault from elite leaders determined to scale it back from the broad ideal that had been articulated in 1776. Ultimately, the American Civil War of 1861 to 1865, understood in Marxist terms with Charles Post, was fought over the question which mode of production, the agrarian slave owner mode of production of the South or the urban industrial capitalist mode of production of the North, was to be the mode of production of westward expansion. After the victory of the North, the particular American exceptionalism of a developed capitalist country without a class-based social democratic party emerged. The answer to Werner Sombart's famous question, why is there no socialism in the United States, resulted, in my view, from a mixture of factors such as, number one, the availability of stolen land capable of cultivation. Second, a comparatively high wage level due to chronic labor shortages that also necessitated the specific technological innovations creating during the efficiency craze and eventually Ford's assembly line. Third, the ethnic fragmentation of a working class composed by ethnicities which immigrated as ethnic waves, each and every new one functioning as a non-unionized, wage-depressing, strike-breaking working class fraction for the previous one. And finally, four, the creation of wages of whiteness as a ruling technique which made the Irish white. Chris mentioned that America, according to Second International Marxism, would have to be the most fertile ground for socialism, and I agree. That was the idea, that socialism is being born from the womb of capitalism itself. But as a result, Eugene Debs' Socialist Party reached its peak in 1912 and was then, in a way, absorbed in a Gramscian trasformismo by which popular revolts from below, from the Midwestern agrarian populist movement to the Pullman general strike, helped modernize capitalist rule and helped bring about the particular social imperialism embodied by the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 and Wilson's entry into World War I. Sombart, contrary to Earl Browder, said In America, there's no space for socialism in between roast beef and apple pie. So, what remains of the legacy of revolution? Revolutionary heritage is passed on from the bourgeoisie to the proletariat in historical terms. Ever since the bourgeoisie and its liberal class sought to forget two things. First, albeit potentially or inevitably violent, overall revolutions are beautiful. Second, revolutions, where they occur, are necessary. So let's look at this for a second. First, as Lukács points out in his essay Tactics and Ethics, written on the occasion of the 1917 October Revolution, the revolutionary carries the moral responsibility of the violence or oppression he may have to enforce during a revolution, especially if the old ruling class is determined to defend its position of privilege at all costs. However, failing to do the revolution inevitably perpetuates the violence and suffering of the system against which the revolution was directed. Lukács warned, those who are ambivalent or even hostile to an ongoing revolution carry the responsibility for all this violence and unnecessary suffering within a surviving capitalist society, which, as he predicted, would lead to another imperialist world war on top of the prolonged class exploitation and oppression. Second, revolutions where they occur are historically inevitable. They are not the outcome of hotheads, of eggheads misleading the masses, but instead they were already being prepared deep down in the grounds of societal contradictions. The American historian M.L. Hansen once commented on the nature of the immigrant: what the son wishes to forget, the grandson wishes to remember. Likewise, the bourgeois revolutionary tradition was inherited by the working class and replaced by proletarian revolution in the core capitalist countries. In the 1890s, socialists were convinced that socialist revolution was inevitable. It was a strength of Marxist theory at the time to conceive of socialism as being born from the womb of capitalist society itself. At the same time, it was a weakness that this scientific instead of utopian understanding of socialism could lead the high priest of international Marxism, Karl Kautsky, to a particular position, which he phrased as this: we are revolutionary, but not a revolution-making party. As if the revolution would come by itself. Bernstein's revisionism, trained largely by English Fabianism, considered a harmonization of capital and labor and a parliamentarian path to socialism possible. It appeared as if the revolution was dead. Bernstein instrumentalized Engels' testimony of 1895 for this message. However, the 1905 revolutions and the mass strike debate in international social democracy showed that social revolution was far from dead. Furthermore, the mass strike as a new revolutionary method of struggle was born, a third weapon next to parliament and struggles at the shop floor in the workspace. The dialectic of war and revolution, which continues until today and informed, in a watered-down fashion obviously, also Obama's electoral victory in 2008, facilitated a world revolution from Ireland to the Far East. Alexander Kollontai, Lenin and Trotsky were correct in their harsh criticisms of Kautsky, Bernstein and the proponents of parliamentarian socialism, who actually believed, like Kautsky, that the post-war government takeovers were already the proletarian revolution itself, and who failed to acknowledge the reality of counter-revolution. Kollontai, Lenin, and Trotsky all maintained that if it hadn't been for the Bolsheviks, Kautsky, Bernstein, and the rest of them would still be, figuratively speaking, lying in the trenches fighting the capitalist class's imperialist war, caused by their own failure to prevent it by national general strikes, according to the oath of the 1907 Second International Convention in Stuttgart. The Bolsheviks were correct by announcing that they had done the revolutionary homework at home, and now it was up to the socialists in the West to do their part under circumstances much more favorable to socialism, given their degree of industrialization, economic sovereignty, and the mass character of the working class in the capitalist core. The Bolsheviks correctly assessed also that the humanity and chances of success for the October Revolution depended on the success of revolution in the West. They were also rightfully saying that it was ironic that those who failed to do their homework ended up handing out style marks to the Bolsheviks for the contradictions of a proletarian revolution that became only this contradictory because the revolutionaries in the West had failed to do their homework. Among the revolutionaries in the West, it was merely Otto Bauer who fought for an understanding that there existed equally legitimate diverging path towards socialist revolution in developed West and underdeveloped East. And it was Antonio Gramsci who, as a devout Leninist, hailed the October Revolution and sought to emulate it under Italian circumstances, later seeking to translate the same project onto a terrain of new conditions. To separate the young from the mature Gramsci is a philological error and dishonest political maneuvering. The experiences of the 1905 and especially the 1917 revolution showed that bourgeois revolutions were not a viable intermediate step to overcome underdevelopment and dependence for peripheral countries. The emergence of the Soviet Union as the first worker state in the world forced national revolutions in the periphery beyond the bourgeois revolutionary framework and into the fold of proletarian revolution. As Edith said, the 1911 Chinese Revolution was the last bourgeois revolution, and it changed everything, including that a communist party could emerge in China under the non-capitalist circumstances of the time. Generally speaking, we must acknowledge, I think, and come to terms with the fact that, historically speaking, the revolution shifted from the core to the periphery, where conditions for revolution are easier, but for building socialism much more difficult. Shifted from proletarian to largely peasant revolutions under communist leadership. The experiences of semi-peripheral and global southern revolutions and their defense against imperialist counter-revolutions, however, has created ideological problems for socialism. Trotsky and Lenin were correct in their assessment that socialism in one country would prove ultimately impossible. At the same time, this doesn't necessarily mean that Trotsky's approach was correct. Generally speaking, we must not lightly surrender the experience of 20th century socialism to apodictic claims of total failure and total terror. For socialists and communists today, the Soviet Union's history is a loss of innocence, obviously, yet it also brought achievements and important experiences. Also, to say today that we are not the offspring of those socialist experiments is too cheap of a way to claim innocence while cutting ourselves off from learning from past experience. And failing to learn means losing our history with all its achievements, as well as risking to make the same mistakes over and over again. Also, the fact that the Chinese Communist Party has succeeded where the Soviet Union failed, i.e. overcoming historic dependencies, and today represents a different path of modernization for peripheral countries, needs to be reckoned with. Reducing China to either authoritarian state capitalism or a socialism with Chinese characteristics is too simple. It remains a big contradiction with an open history, and proletarian internationalism always meant thinking in terms of relationships of forces within an imperialist world system. Advances in any country are advances of socialism elsewhere and vice versa. And yet we are not in China but in the West, so where does that leave us? Whether the world historic shift of revolution from the north to the south means that revolution in the global north is no longer a viability is the $1 million question. In some respects, we don't know what works, but rather what hasn't worked, at least under the specific conditions of the 20th century. This may include revolution in the north, but it surely includes the Bernsteinian illusions of parliamentary socialism. At the same time, also the core periphery relationships are shifting. We are at a world historical turning point. 500 years of North Atlantic domination in the world are coming to an end. The world economy is shifting from the north and west to the south and west. What if we're the semi-periphery now, and what if the revolution therefore returns back to the former core capitalist countries? Thank you very much.
Okay, so I've got a few notes. Thank you both for your talks. Mostly, so I'll start with your comments, comrade. I agree with you more, so I kind of wanted to, I found most of it agreeable. I think that something that's important to note is that the historical experience of world revolution, and the failure of world revolution, but also the historical experiences of it, show us that, and this is something that Lenin and Trotsky theorized, is that it is not the most developed capitalist countries, but rather places where the accumulation of capitalism's contradictions becomes most acute, that we see the first ruptures in the revolutionary chain. It is exactly for this reason that it was Russia, not Britain, in which revolution broke out first in the 20th century. And today we see all manner of countries in the semi-periphery where the intense contradictions of capitalist development and the limits of that development are expressed most clearly. But it is exactly also true, as you mentioned. I believe the quote from Lenin is that the revolution was easier to initiate in these countries, but it is all the more harder to complete. And it is actually, and the inverse is true of the advanced capitalist countries, where the revolution is more difficult to initiate, but it is easier to complete. This is why exactly I think we must understand these things as part of a world cycle of revolutions, not a particular national dynamic. Responding to Chris, I guess my first question is, I think the question that's going to define a lot of this discussion is America exempt from the laws of history? I don't think so. We had to address the problems of the failure of the American Revolution. I mean the third one, the one that we were expecting to happen. The reality is it didn't happen. I find the story that you tell about why Marxists love America, I think it's mostly true, but I think it smooths over some important contradictions. You quote Browder, but it's not Browder, just the exact representation of the total degeneration that was Stalinism. And in fact, return to I guess you'd today call it socialism or American characteristics.
Yeah.
But socialism, communism is 20th century Americanism.
Yeah.
This was exactly a representation of popular frontism and an unwillingness to break with the capitalist class. And in fact, a coalition which saw the American Communist Party move to the right of even the centrist Socialist Party of America,
right.
which maintained its centrism against the right return of the Americans, the communists. This is exactly the problem. I think that what is not being addressed here is the relationship between this kind of invocation of the bourgeois revolutions and Stalinism. For it is exactly Stalinism that heavily emphasized this dynamic in the 20th century.
Yep.
I want to take up something that you referenced, Comrade, and I didn't take it right because I didn't write them all down because I will be honest with you, comrades. I didn't bring any any of my books with me to the United States because I didn't want them to be seized by airport security.
Oh, sure.
So I didn't have my copy of Prisoners of the American Dream on me. But I read that last year for my own branch reading group in my local section. And I think it's exactly, we have to ask the question of what objective dynamics in American capitalism and subjective failures of the American socialist movement led to the solidification and sedimentation of the historical failures of the American working class, and in fact a negative dialectic which produced a more and more segmented and stratified working class, one which it was one in which its revolutionary potential was imprisoned within the interstate system and suburbia and endless consumption. I think in turn we have to address the problem that in the core, just as the liberal revolutionaries of the 19th century became the butchers of the Paris Commune, so too, in the course of the 20th century, does the United States move from the greatest of the bourgeois revolutionary powers to the world headquarters of counter-revolution. A world headquarters of counter-revolution that presided over the butchering of communist revolutionaries from Chile to Indonesia, throughout Africa, etc. It is this world headquarters of international counter-revolution that today we still must struggle against. So my answer to the question of is America exempt from the laws of history is no. My answer to the question of is America still at the heart of any world revolution is yes. But this advance cannot be made if the American working class does not accept its position, does not challenge its position as the backbone of the global epicenter of counter-revolution, which today it remains. Thank you.
Okay, a couple of things. So I wanted to, Edith, I think that you talked about the three American revolutions and included the sort of second Reconstruction, the 1960s. I thought you were going to say something else, and also I realized I didn't bring up in my presentation, but I think is relevant to what Ingar was discussing. We forget about the Jeffersonian Revolution of 1800. Right, so the idea of a kind of a thermidor or counter-revolution in the American Constitution leaves aside the fact that the interpretation of the Constitution was radicalized through the Jeffersonian Revolution of 1800. So Jefferson supported the U.S. Constitution, but he differed over its interpretation with John Adams and Alexander Hamilton, with George Washington being a kind of ambivalent figure in this. And he organized the working class in his Democratic Republican Party to achieve his electoral revolution of 1800. And it's in pretty short order after the 2 terms in office of Jefferson that the Supreme Court and through other kinds of precedents interpret the U.S. Constitution in a very different way than looked to be the case in the 1790s. So I mentioned Jefferson organized the working class in his Democratic Republican Party of 1800. Who was that working class, and how did they participate in the electoral revolution of 1800? They were, of course, an artisanal working class, not a proletarianized working class. And when we think about property rights and as a qualification for voting, we leave aside how that could be interpreted. So the American Republic, like many of the bourgeois revolutions from the Dutch Republic onward, took some inspiration from the Renaissance city-states and how workers were represented in those small republics. Meaning that either membership in a guild or ownership of tools, qualifications by skill, could count as property. In other words, that could get you past the property hurdle in terms of the franchise. So yes, it's not universal franchise, but it's important to understand that the working class, first of all, they were not the poorest people in society by any means. And second of all, they were not disenfranchised by property qualifications in the way that we think about property in terms of like land or ownership of a capitalist enterprise. That's important, I think, because of course the Democratic Republican Party of Jefferson is the precedent for the later Republican Party of Lincoln. So the Democratic Republicans were called by shorthand the Republican Party. That party split into the Democratic Party and the Whig Party with Andrew Jackson. And then finally the Republican Party came out of the Whig Party and included the abolitionists, and they harked back to Jefferson's Democratic Republican Party. Now I raise all of this because, of course, this is before the era of the Second Industrial Revolution and the era of Marxism and mass socialist parties and this kind of thing. I brought up Earl Browder semi-ironically, of course, right? So only to say that, to my chagrin, I looked into, I probably knew this years ago from reading the history of the American Communist Party, but more recently I had to remind myself that William Z. Foster and Earl Browder were both members of Eugene Debs' Socialist Party. They both went back to that tradition. And I was, again, a little bit chagrined or horrified to see that. And yet it also challenged me to think, okay, how would it have been plausible for people to have gone from the pre-World War I Eugene Debs Socialist Party into the split that produced the Communist Party and ultimately into the Stalinization of that party in the 1930s? How would that have been a plausible thing for people who had come to consciousness, learned all their socialist organizing as pre-World War I Socialist Party of America, Debs-style and Kautskian socialists? How would that translate? And of course, this was not only true in the United States, but in other places. And so I think that the question of Stalinism, I think, is a difficult one, because on the one hand, It's clear that Marxism did produce Stalinism. That is obviously true. On the other hand, it's also clear that there was a significant liquidation of Marxism involved in Stalinism. I think the painful question is, could the revolutions of the 20th century have occurred without Marxism? I don't resolve that in favor of saying, oh, it's like the contradictions of the revolution or the contradictions of Marxism. When we're talking about the Chinese Revolution or Cuba or Vietnam or Korea, I think that rather it really points back to the question of Marxism itself. And that's why I centered my talk on the emergence of the US as the great capitalist country of the 20th century in the Second Industrial Revolution. So yes, the American Revolution and the fate of the American Revolution still endures as a task in socialism. And yes, the United States did become the garrison of counter-revolution in the 20th century. But I would offer a kind of dialectical view of revolution and counter-revolution in this context, and I would say that perhaps there was a kernel of truth to American anti-communism, not only as a counter-revolutionary force, but also as an attempt to preserve the revolution. Meaning that there's a real split in the context of the Cold War and a real contradiction between revolution and counter-revolution in the 20th century. And I don't think that can be parsed out in terms of, well, the East is some kind of revolution, however deformed, and the West is the counter-revolution. I think that this dialectic of revolution and counter-revolution cuts through both sides of the Cold War. But again, raises the entire question of Marxism and socialism at a very fundamental level. Meaning, that's why I brought up that we're haunted by Marxism. Even in the United States, that it hasn't had a mass Marxist-influenced socialist movement since the time of Debs. Nonetheless, it is there, and I don't think that it just comes in a roundabout way. I don't think it comes from Europe. I don't think that the only reason why people in America remember Marxism is because of verso books or historical materialism publishers. No, I think it's here. And I think that indeed it might be the opposite, meaning verso and historical materialism may not only depend on an American market to stay in business, but might depend on America itself to have Marxism make any sense whatsoever.
I want to start with the question of the segmented and the stratified working class that Edith brought up. Because the notion that socialism is scientific was connected to the idea that like all the primitive communist dreams that you can trace back to early Christianity and like the other religions as Kautsky did in his writings, which can give us some hope because it means that socialism is nothing unnatural. On the contrary, capitalism is unnatural. And has always been a sentiment that we as human beings depend on collectives. Like we cannot sustain ourselves without being in a collective. And the main contradiction of capitalism is that we have socialized production, but private property in the means of production. I think that remains as Marx announced it, and that socialism then became a powerful force when socialist utopias suddenly were connected to real social forces in society that develop with the developing contradictions of capitalism, namely the working class. So intellectuals and their socialist ideas with the working class. And today we are in a crisis of socialism because that connection, it has not been completely dismantled or dissolved, but obviously we don't have, especially not in the former core capitalist countries, a working class movement on the upsurge. Like we're still recovering from the neoliberal counter-revolution that basically wiped out the two of the three pillars of anti-capitalism, which was, number one, working class power in the West, trade union power in the West, which is what in the US the Volkerschock did with mass unemployment, and also opening up, using the debt crisis in the global South, what we today call the global South, as a way of pitting workers against one another through capital mobility, the ability of capital to relocate, and therefore creating all sorts of competitive corporatist strategies amongst real existing trade unions, etc. So, and I think we're still trying to recover from all of that, and at the same time, like liberalism and the experience of the New Democrats in the United States, New Labour in Britain, and the Neue Mitte in Germany have taught us that without the working class, no social progress can be made, right? Like that's why we got like all forms of symbolic victories from the new social movements, but not real victories, right? Like we have, for instance, the feminist movement, we have gender-sensitive language, but we don't have free daycare and we don't have free care for the elderly. Like where it really materially matters, and why? Because the working class, when the new social movements came to power under Clinton, under Blair, under Gerhard Schröder, were in the total defense, but they would have been the only ones to make it materially painful for the capitalist class by seizing something as free daycare and free care for the elderly. So we are at a conundrum. We have to rebuild the working class in order to achieve any kind of progress, be it civic rights to material benefits. And I think the good thing is that we can start with the idea that the segmentation and stratification that Edith has spoken about is not an unnatural state, but it's the natural state of the working class. Like that's something that we can learn from E.P. Thompson, or we can learn it from the state theory of Nikos Poulantzas, who argued that the capitalist state is individualizing and disorganizing the working class through grades in high school, through all kinds of credits that you get at university, ranking individuals and putting them into the competition of capitalism itself. And we can learn it from Leo Panitch and Sam Gindin with the idea that the working class is harmed itself. Like, workers are not ideal revolutionary subjects, right? They're under the constant control of capitalist enterprises, and obviously that does something to their subjectivity. And they learn the self-confidence of a revolutionary class through the revolution itself. So it's basically up to socialists to create the working class that can really actually overcome capitalism. So that's the one thing that I wanted to mention. And regarding the United States and whether, like, the revolutionary legacy, I mean, what I find interesting is the question, like, why do you have had millennial socialism while we had millennial fascism in continental Europe, or have? And I think one thing that can be noticed is that where you have societies where there is a real erosion of the mid-income working class, right? That there you have the potential for bottom-middle coalitions, and they turn left or can turn left, whereas you have a working class that has a lot to lose, like in countries like Germany or the Netherlands or Belgium or Denmark or Sweden. They have status panic, and then they turn right. Like they will basically follow right-wing ideologies that say, okay, there's not enough for everyone. So basically we have to take it out on the underclass or the lower classes. And in my view, like the United States has already, because of tuition fees, because of deindustrialization, because of like a number of factors, also the trade union weakness, like has already experienced the erosion of the wage-earning middle classes, and therefore there is a potential for millennial socialism or like bottom-middle coalitions. And I wonder, and I'd be curious to hear your positions on this, that like when I started dealing with American socialism in my writings, I was struck by the fact that even linguistically there used to be no socialism in the United States. Like if you were left, you were a liberal, and if you were right, you were a conservative, and sometimes in academia you would recognize the radical, right? Like how could you build a movement when it wasn't even represented linguistically? But now it is, right? Now socialism is back, and it may or may not mean social democratic welfarism, but it is something to build upon. And I remember in the mid-2000s, I wrote an essay for Capital and Class about this too. There were Stanley Aronowitz and Rick Wolff, who argued that, you know, working through the Democratic Party, alignment with the Democratic Party, de-radicalized the left coming out of the 60s. And they argued for a working class-based left-wing party. And then suddenly Sanders came about through the irony of history of the two-party system. Like people like Sanders in continental Europe would have been part of third and fourth and fifth parties, and they would have been basically made impotent as a result, right? Like social democracy in Germany or like in countries like France and Greece like has no potential whatsoever. There's no ideological, like nothing burning anymore, right? They can't have a burnout because they're not even glimmering, and you couldn't light a cigarette with them. And so, but it was possible here in the US, but at the same time now we're seeing the end of Sanderism, and we're also seeing the failure of the dirty break strategy that Eric Blanc put out. And I'm curious whether are you back at square one, you know, where Stanley Aronowitz and Rick Wolff said we need a third party, and I'd be curious to hear more from the American comrades about those things. Last idea, since you were mentioning freedom, and I put it shortly, I wouldn't put freedom and welfarism or socialism in an opposition or juxtapose them, because I do think that we have a very clear case, especially in a country like the US where liberty has such an important role, or plays such an important role, is that freedom is the precondition, or socialism is the precondition for freedom. None other than Kautsky made that argument very convincingly, saying that to all the bourgeois intellectuals, you say that socialism is destroying liberty and freedom, but your idea of freedom is that of the artisan of the 18th century, and capitalism itself is destroying that freedom, the freedom in your labor, right? That you determine yourself, like when you work, how you work, what you produce, etc. But that is like the capitalist process of proletarianization is undoing that. And therefore, we have a different sense of freedom. Like we won't undo the social division of labor. We can't, right? Like that is going to stick. But we're going to create freedom for you through the radical reduction of work hours, right? You will have freedom beyond your work. You will be working 4 hours a day, and for the rest of the time, you will be able to learn a language and to basically become like a Hellenistic, like almost Nietzschean. Kautsky actually resorts to Nietzsche, but says it's a Nietzsche for everyone, right? Like we can all have like a Dionysian, like an ancient Hellenistic lifestyle. And I think that's something that might resonate with Americans. It might not resonate with Germans because we're used to the Prussian state.
Can I just do a quick response? Yeah. And then we do the questions. I just want to just quickly respond to one thing, or maybe a couple of things. So one thing is the stratification question. Ingar, I think you invoked the neoliberal, like the so-called race to the bottom, right? So race to the bottom, not only in the periphery, but also in the core, not only in the developing world, but also in the developed world. So I don't think of stratification as a question of like de-radicalization or aristocracy of labor and this kind of thing. I think of stratification as actually the opposite, which is that it's actually pulling the entire working class down. So that's one thing. The other thing is freedom. And thinking about, is socialism a precondition for freedom, or is freedom a precondition for socialism? Well, today, of course, we need freedom to produce a socialist party. And so the freedom that exists in the United States, freedom of speech, freedom of association that does not exist in Europe. That does not exist in Europe, where religious organizations are controlled by the state, where the state funds some religious institutions, but not others. So the state's not going to fund a cult. In the United States, they don't fund any of it, so that means you can have cults, right? You don't have the state deciding what a true religion is. That's huge for building a socialist movement, because a socialist movement is going to be called a cult by the capitalists, right? No, seriously. And, because I think that it is still the case, there's freedom in the United States that there isn't in any other country. And it's the freedom to produce a socialist movement and a socialist party that doesn't exist elsewhere. You're not going to start a new socialist party in China, but also you're not going to start a new socialist party in Germany. The freedom to do it is here.
Then why don't you have one?
I'm trying. I'm trying.
Does anybody want to respond? Okay, we're going to go to questions, and I would just ask that we hold the applause now that the questions have started.
Shall we?
Okay.
Yes. Yeah, you can.
We're going to start with right there.
Hi, thank you for responding. I was kind of, with the line of kind of statement around the fact that we kind of, the working class is constantly under siege, right? And it's kind of a socialist responsibility to verify the conditions around working class to make it revolutionary. I was wondering if that means that the leftist parties, or the socialist parties of America, have kind of failed the American working class by being political instead of social. Or in other words, like a political party or an American socialist party should be like a grocery store before it's a club. You know what I mean?
Anybody want to take that question?
Is that directed? Ingar? Maybe?
Well, I do think that if I understand your question correctly, and I don't want to judge our American comrades because we're doing pretty badly in continental Europe as well. But I think that Chris has a very important point with regards to the welfare state, because the welfare state, even though I do agree, or I'm convinced that the defense is important, but at the same time it did demobilize the working class, right? Many of the things, the grievances that used to be dealt with at a civil society level of workers amongst themselves, right? Like all the insecurities that capitalism harms workers with were self-organized or against by workers. Today, it's all mediated through the nation state, and through the mediation through the nation state, we do get like a strong sense of individualization. It's individual rights, it's not class rights, and at the same time, citizenship then it includes privileges, right? Vested interests, like the idea that because you have citizenship, you have more rights than others, like the latecomers, for instance, right? And so that's, I think I don't know how to work around this, because I mean, it's not a viable solution to say, let the neoliberals dismantle our entire welfare states, and then we're back in mid-19th century capitalism, and then we build it up again, and we do it differently this time. That's not going to work, but I do think that we have to recognize with that notion and possibly find ways of working class self-organization underneath the state level. Like,
I have something to say about that.
Absolutely. Is it on?
Should be.
Okay. Is that working?
No,
There we go.
All right. Okay. I find this. While I agree that ultimately welfarism is like a structure of capitalist regulation, and Marx himself obviously opposed capitalist welfare measures in the Critique of the Goethe program, but what I think is clear is that the passage of from competitive to monopoly capitalism in the course of the transition to the 20th century sees the emergence of an increasing role of the state in the regulation of the wage relation. And this actually means that that the social question becomes decisively political. There can be no, workplace regulation of the wage relation. It can only be regulated at the level of the state. And that means a question of state power is posed immediately. So I think it is exactly the fact that it is exactly this state integration of state and capital and the regulation of the wage fund through various systems of corporatism, etc., that makes the political question a burning necessity, more than it was in Marx's time, I would argue.
Let me make one reference because I think, Ingar, you brought up Bernstein being influenced by the Fabians. Well, guess who the Fabians were influenced by? Bismarck.
Yeah.
So it comes full circle, right? As Rosa Luxemburg said, Bernstein exhibited a certain Lassalleanism, to come back to the critique of the Gotha program, and really identified the statification of the economy and the working class's participation in the state with socialism, with the evolution of socialism. Now, interestingly, he was not thinking about Germany. He was thinking maybe Germany still needs a revolution because it's an autocratic state. He was thinking of England, France, and the United States when thinking of evolutionary socialism. He didn't think, he of course would have loved for that to be the case in Germany, but he thought, well, actually we might need a revolution in Germany, in fact, because of the autocracy. And so I think that this question of the state and the enmeshment of capitalism in the state, that's the big puzzle. If you talk to the DSA, if you talk to the Jacobin writers, they will say, we can't be Rosa Luxemburg or Lenin today because the role of the state is much greater today than it was in their time. And, invoking like Ralph Miliband, but also taking some inspiration from Leo Panitch, would say, and the state no longer belongs to the capitalist class the way it did in their time, but the state now, the working class has a stake in that state. And of course, I would say this is the wrong way of thinking about it. In other words, it's not about the sociological, composition or access to the state. Of course, the working class has had access to the state for a long time. It's rather what the role of the state is in capitalism. In other words, is its role to socialize production, or is its role to accumulate capital? And I think that there was actually a discussion early in Jacobin before Bernie Sanders about what defines a party as capitalist or socialist is not like, do the capitalists support it, but rather does the party subordinate itself to the needs of capital accumulation. That has been completely forgotten, conveniently, in the meantime. So there was, I would say, a moment. There was a millennial socialist moment where it was a socialist moment, and it wasn't a welfare state moment, because actually they understood, well, the welfare state is part of the state's commitment to capital accumulation, however contradictorily, but nonetheless, it would still, so that you could have a labor party that's a capitalist party, that there's no contradiction there, for example. They were thinking about these things. That's all out the window now. And that's something for us to at least ponder.
Got one right over here. Ryan. Yeah, depending.
Let's go ahead.
Well, Marxists certainly defend the anti-colonial revolution, the American Revolution. But it's necessary to defend Comrade Debs from Professor Catron.
Try.
To present the American Revolution as some sort of unadulterated, triumph of freedom. It was a bourgeois revolution. So let me just read a couple things that Debs actually said about the American Revolution on the 125th anniversary. The founders of the Republic, declaring that men were created equal, evidently not themselves alone. and he spent most of his presentation condemning chattel slavery and linking it to the existence of wage slavery. So it's useful that Platypus has panels where people can learn about history and debate. It's not useful to have dishonest presentations. You can't learn anything about the history of the left, and you certainly can't intervene in society to win the working class to the necessity of socialism by cherry picking. Look, Thomas Jefferson was a slave owner. His presidency initiated the rupture of relations with Haiti because he was worried about the spread of anti-slave revolutions. They then blockaded Haiti. That was, the material interests of the slavocracy. Comrade Edith correctly pointed to the fact that has never been a reformist labor party in this country, not even a break from the capitalist parties. And it's the question of finishing the Civil War that is the fundamental, question of black oppression, which is the secret sauce of American imperialism that, has it's their advantage over their imperialist rivals because the working class is continuously divided. So, anybody who's here who actually wants to change what's going on in society, I think you've got to say, why is it that the George Floyd rebellions, for instance, were not successful in, fundamentally fighting against black racial oppression, against segregation? So come check out, read Black History and the Class Struggle, if you're interested in changing the world. If not, and if you don't even want an honest presentation about American history, then listen to Professor Catron.
Well, I guess we'll have our duel on cherry bombing quotes. So, yes, of course. And others such as John Reed claimed that the Civil War was not really about slavery, but it was about Northern capital dominating the South. How should we take that one? That's a speech to the Third International. I prefer the Debs who said that if they were alive today, Jefferson and Lincoln would be members of the Socialist Party and not the Democrat or Republican parties. That's a more obscure way of putting it. It involves a kind of a leap in thinking. If Jefferson and Lincoln were alive today, they'd be members of the Socialist Party. What does that mean? But that's what we really have to think about. In other words, how did they understand the revolutionary tradition? To give in to this counter-revolution of 1776 stuff, 1619 Project stuff, that's the Democratic Party's line. That's not any kind of socialist line. That's going to be taught in every school in America. Thomas Jefferson was a slaveholder. The revolution was a slaveholders' revolt. The Civil War wasn't really about slavery. That's the Redeemer narrative. That's triumphed now. That has triumphed. Debs is rolling in his grave in the face of that.
I think the quote about Jefferson and Lincoln, if they were alive in Debs' time being members of the Socialist Party, is interesting. Because, if my cat had wheels, it would be a bicycle. I think it's totally obtuse. But,
Debs said it.
Well, yeah. No,
so what did he mean by it?
I guess I'll go and find him and tell him off.
What did he mean by it?
I think the key question is, what do we face when we try to confront the history of the American Revolution? I don't think anyone here is arguing for a 1619 Project interpretation. Well,
really? Yeah, you are. You are. New York Times. You're with the New York Times. That's what you're with.
Said that any Marxist should defend the anti-colonial rebellion of the American Revolution.
But
what? He did.
But Jefferson.
I've got the microphone, Chris. And you got an extra time to respond before, so let's be clear about that.
Sorry.
I see who pulls the strings here.
We're not bean counters. We're not bean counters here.
I think that the task that, But I mean, I think that, the reality that we face is the historic transition of the bourgeois revolution to a bourgeois counter-revolution. And it is exactly the same forces of the bourgeois revolution that make that counter-revolution. It is exactly the same forces that made the bourgeois revolution in England, who then suppressed the levelers and diggers, etc., etc. It is the same forces that made the revolution in France that would go on to suppress the revolutionary trends that came forth from that movement. I think today, and this is I think that this question of freedom, I think that freedom, do we need freedom to have socialism or socialism to have freedom? I think this to me is almost theological.
Freedom to build a socialist movement.
We need to achieve a consistent struggle for democratic liberties in every country, and that includes in the United States. I've traveled to many countries, and I've never had my bag searched for revolutionary literature before. And not in Europe, but I did in the United States. I've traveled to Europe many times for political events. I've never had my phone searched by border guards asking about my political activities, but I did when I came here for this conference. So I think there's a question about political liberty there.
Mm-hmm.
I think the defense of democratic liberties is the light and air of the socialist movement. And that's Kautsky, so you know. And I think that's all I have to say.
Okay, let's go to Pam.
Well, maybe just one last quote. Frederick Douglass says, "The Constitution leans towards freedom and therefore remains the North Star for liberty." So, I guess Domenico Lasorda is with us in the room.
Yes.
And it's liberalism versus democracy. And the socialists are being identified with democracy by at least two of the panelists, it seems. And so it just raises the question, I guess, of the Marxist clarification of the concept of freedom. To what extent does Marx tell us that it's the battle of democracy which needs to be waged by the socialists towards greater human flourishing? And to what extent does the American Revolution remain in that way, a kind of guiding light towards that human flourishing? But maybe to put it more concretely, it seems like there are three different philosophies of histories that were being presented. Chris said that there's a continuation from Locke to the Jeffersonian Democratic Revolution, Lincoln and Marx, and then Debs. So maybe I would ask him to kind of clarify that genealogy and how we inherit that problem of freedom in the present. And then there's an alternative, which is that liberalism is the counter-revolution, and that the socialists inherit the democratic revolution, or the democratic moment in the phase of the revolution. And in what way then do we need Marxism for that? It would just be liberal Democrats. Like, why do we need Marxism to defend democracy? Or if it's something more, if it's the proletariat revolution against the bourgeois revolution, what is it that we're letting go of or overcoming? What is it that we're rejecting within the bourgeois revolution? Is it individualism against collectivism? Or what is it that we need to overcome from the bourgeois revolution? Because Chris proposed that the proletariat revolution is a recovery for the fulfillment of the bourgeois revolution under contradictory conditions of capitalism. So that seems to be a major disagreement, a kind of philosophy of history of revolution and freedom.
You want to go first?
One thing that I'd bring up, because Shays' Rebellion was raised. So Jefferson was the ambassador to France at that time, and he wrote back his famous letter on the Shays' Rebellion, where he said, "The tree of liberty must be watered from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants." There's more to it than that. He says, "Let the people revolt," because it warns the leaders. And to not have the people revolt would be the death of liberty. Right? So even if they're wrong, right? So he said, even if they're wrong, the people's right to revolt and actual revolt is better than if they don't revolt. That doesn't sound like someone who's only interested in their own personal freedom as a slaveholder. That doesn't sound like that, does it? Nonetheless, he supported the Constitution, but again engaged in a political struggle over its meaning, over its practical interpretation, over its implementation. And he included slavery and wanted more condemnation of slavery in the Declaration of Independence. And of course, he famously said that it was his lifelong project to eliminate slavery from America, and he felt like it was his biggest failure. So if that's, if we're going to remember it, we've got to remember it in its totality. Now, I tried to raise, and I know it's an obscure point, the dialectic of revolution and counter-revolution, meaning capitalism is both the revolution and the counter-revolution. It's the continuation of the revolution, but it's also the counter-revolution within that revolution. And it's not a simple matter of, which side are you on, comrades? Especially not today in 2026. Which side are you on, comrades? Are you on the side of the revolution, or are you on the side of the counter-revolution? First of all, Marxism never treated it as straightforwardly or simply as that. Not with respect to the bourgeois revolutions, and not with respect to the socialist revolution itself. It was never a matter of which side are you on, comrades. And yet, that's where the left has been stuck since the 1930s. And it's been very destructive. It's killed any potential socialist movement even before it was born, since the 1930s. The connection to Locke, of course, is that Locke's the thinker of the Glorious Revolution. And it's the clearest, articulation of the right to labor and property as based in labor, not based in possession, all of that. And it's the Lockean principles that inform both the American and French revolutions. I pointed out in my presentation very summarily that it was both an asset and a liability for the French revolutionaries that they were Anglophiles. In other words, what they had in mind was the model of the English Revolution. And in fact, there was a radicalization of the Enlightenment after Locke. I see Rousseau as transcending Locke, as radicalizing Locke, as building off Locke, but radicalizing it. And that's influential for both the American and French revolutions, that radicalization of Locke, which I, again, summarily pointed out in terms of why the right to life, liberty, and property was rewritten as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, even though much later, in the era of industrial capitalism, the Supreme Court reinterpreted pursuit of happiness to mean property. Right? Ironically enough, that it wasn't meant to be property. It was meant to be pursuit of happiness because they understood property is just the form we have now, but it shouldn't be enshrined as a right, otherwise it will become a limit to freedom.
So on the question of the relationship between the proletarian and bourgeois revolution, whether it is what are we revolting against with the bourgeois revolution, I think I said it in my original talk.
You did, yeah.
That it fulfills and negates the bourgeois revolution.
That's right.
It both completes them and it negates them and it transcends them. It goes beyond their limits. This is, I think, necessary. The phrase that was like, are we revolting against the bourgeois revolutions? Or are we continuing them? This is a undialectical formulation. It is neither. It is both. It is, of course, the bourgeois revolutions that unleashed the historical process by which the proletariat was both born and will be abolished. That is obviously true. This is essential, fundamental, elementary Marxism, in my opinion.
Yep.
It is bourgeois democracy, the bourgeois liberal constitutional regime that gives a political form through which the struggle, this battle, will be carried out. But it cannot be realized within that form.
Right.
The proletarian revolution cannot be realized within the American Constitution.
Right.
It is exactly this. I describe it as thermidorian. Me and Chris will probably disagree about the details of that. I do think it is fundamentally a thermidorian document. I think I am a Democrat, not a liberal monarchist, or a Republican monarchist. They ultimately, I think that, and you know, just as the American Revolution, I think perfected or advanced, perfected is the wrong word, advanced the form of the English Revolution. I also think that the French Revolution advanced the form of the American Revolution by postulating the democratic republic as a unicameral form of a maximally democratic republic as the elementary political form. I think that it is exactly, you know, the bourgeois revolutions unleash the flourishing of the movement for women's liberation, the movement for the abolition of slavery, the movement to both unleashes colonialism and the movement to overturn colonialism. You know, it is both, you know, it unleashes all these things, but these revolutions cannot be completed under capitalist society. And it is for that reason that the proletariat must take up the tasks of the bourgeois revolution that the bourgeoisie left lying on the floor, but it also must learn to stand on its own feet and be confident in itself as a class. It cannot do so if it feels if it endlessly ties itself to a bourgeoisie who will not even defend their own revolutions.
Of course.
I think, like, thinking about history is always useful in the sense that I personally look at a historical period in time and I think to myself, okay, how would I have acted? Like, with which side would I have sided, and what would that have entailed? So I think in that respect, obviously, it's important to look at history and say, was that progressive overall, or was that reactionary? At the same time, legal documents, I would say, always represent relationships of forces, right? Not like an ideational discourse, you know, just we have historical materialists, so we draw it back to that. And obviously there's historical periods that are more progressive and historical periods that are more reactionary. So we do have legal documents that date back to periods that where the popular classes had a bigger say in paving the way to that document. For instance, like obviously, given the fallout of capitalist crisis, fascism, and war in Europe, ironically, like the socialist movement, the communist movements, were strongest in those parts that then became part of the Cold War in the West, right? In France and Italy, because they carried the partisan movements, like basically the bourgeoisie failed in national liberation from fascism, so the communists had to take that role. And we do have very, very progressive constitutions in Western Europe coming out after World War II. Just like, you know, pretty much similar also to the Second Bill of Rights, you know, that came out of Roosevelt. Yeah. And the communists in West Germany said, we didn't vote for it. We didn't vote for the basic constitution of the Federal Republic of Germany, but there'll come the time where we'll have to defend it against you. And I think that's important to note, that there's certain ingrained or vested rights that will come under attack by the bourgeoisie when the interests of the bourgeoisie necessitate it, right? Because we know that capitalism is compatible with a lot of different forms of political rule. It's compatible with liberal rule, but it's also compatible with fascist rule and authoritarian rule. And therefore, there moments arise when the capitalist class will be opposed to what used to be in favor of its interests. But we also know, and I do agree with you, Chris, that like obviously it's better to build a socialist party in a situation where you have fundamental civic rights. Oftentimes, like, you know, we have a lot of Iranian communist exiles in Germany, and they will say, you have all those opportunities, why don't you use them? Yeah. Right? Like, if we had all those opportunities to go door to door, to speak to people, and like, we would use that. and you should too. Canvassing,
Yes.
stuff like that. So that's my response to this. Great.
We've got, and pink in the back over there.
Good evening, thank you. I had two thoughts. Thank you for the panel. I mean, it was really, my brain is whirling and whirling all day. But I had two thoughts. One I wanted to cover quickly is that I don't think it's right to say that Marxism gave us Stalinism. Stalinism was counter-revolutionary. It did not come from Marxism. It came from the fact that the new Soviet Union was under attack by imperialist countries, had a famine, it had a lot of necessity. It couldn't afford to finish the revolution. It did not have the means. It had Russia was a backward country. It was very illiterate. It had a lot of friggin' problems that it could not solve. And that gave rise to a bureaucratic caste led by Stalin, who just happened to have a great bureaucratic leader. And the one thing about Stalinism, besides being class collaborationist, is to me, and maybe this is more of a moralistic point than anything, is that the people that caved to Stalinism, you were talking about the line of Foster and
Browder.
At some point they lose their principles and their solidarity with the working class. And so the other point you made about which side are you on? I am firmly on the side of the working class. And I was a labor activist. I was a union organizer. Which side am I on? I'm on the side of the working class, and that is a line I look at every day as a Marxist. So, and that just got me to the failure of the American Revolution to have a workers' revolution and even to have a labor party. So many reasons why, but in all the discussions, I think the other thing we do have to remember is the power of the system we are fighting against. I mean, I think, Edith, you referred to what it has done in other countries. It also does that in the United States. And we are up against the biggest imperialist giant in the world. Yes, we have certain rights to organize and do things, and I think we should do that. But, we have to acknowledge the material reality of what has happened in this country. One of you mentioned McCarthyism and what it did to the movements. It decimated the movements. It decimated the radical leadership in the labor movement in particular. And so then I guess get to, well, how do you have hope in the United States that the United States would have a workers' revolution? It's a couple of things, and I think it does go back to how it can be true that you read the 1619 Project, and it's true that the bourgeois revolution we had did advance us forward. I think both of those things are true. It's not, wouldn't pit the 1619 Project against its important history. Slavery was one of the most shameful things in the development of this country and continues to be a problem to this day. And if you look at the South of the U.S. and the rights of people there. So when I look at the hope of the working class in this country, it is very much, it's the image of workers that I think often gets distorted. The workers in this country who are going to make a successful revolution are the poorest and the most oppressed. And who is that? It is African Americans in this country. It is Latinos and immigrants. It is the poorest of the poor, and it is women. So you've got to look at this multi-hued, and you have to address. No, you. Okay, I'm lecturing. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And let me just say this as me. When I'm an organizer for the Freedom Socialist Party now, so every day my thought is, how do we advance the revolution in this country? And it is looking at raising the consciousness of the entire working class, and that includes organized labor, but it includes unorganized labor. Because, as you mentioned, organized labor is very small, and who's not in those unions as much is the poorest of the poor. And that's where I think Marxism is so important, to raise the consciousness, and that's the other thing about revolution. We can objectively see we need a revolution, but how do you get the subjective minds there with you? And I think that is the hardest, that is our job. It is a hard job, but that is our job.
Maybe we'll get another question, and can I get the hands up? Who's got their hands up? Okay, let's do, oh my goodness, so many people. The green, yeah.
Yeah, thanks everyone. So, Ingar, you mentioned that capitalist governments can rule in many different forms, and you mentioned liberal forms, fascist forms. Would you consider capitalist governments to be able to rule through democratic forms as well, in the sense that, like, Pam brought up some really great points, I think, about, the kind of distinction between liberalism and democracy, and the story you tell about, the history of revolutions. And so, I do want to consider, how can liberalism become revolutionary? How can democracy also become revolutionary? And just kind of fleshing out, that I just don't want to be too one-sided in the way that, we think about these things.
I have thoughts on that too.
Does anybody want to take that question?
Ingar, and then
Well, I think that the point that I tried to make when comparing Hayek to Schmidt was that if our idea of authoritarian or fascist rule is basically the 1930s formula, then we will not be able to recognize it, because the capitalist class has learned to deal with the problem of the working class majority, right? Because their fear was when liberalism, as you know, in classical liberalism in Britain, only 2% of the population were allowed to vote because of property qualifications, right? And it was a long struggle of democracy. I would say democracy and liberalism are antagonists in that relationship. A long struggle of democratizing liberalism, but sticking to the liberal framework of representative democracy, because obviously it's very different from the understanding that the classic Greeks had of ancient democracy, which was much more direct, but based on a slave-owning society, and had to be because of the development of the productive forces at the time. But so if we look at that, the problem for the bourgeoisie was, or the fear was, if we have universal suffrage, who will safeguard that the working class is not going to go the evolutionary socialist way and unelect private property? We know now that the fear was overemphasized, but nonetheless, that was where Carl Schmitt initially had those 19th century ideas of a counter-revolutionary decisive battle, right? Going to Donoso Cortes and Bonald and all those people. And then the neoliberals were superior to that, because they realized we can have universal suffrage, people can vote, but their vote doesn't matter anything because we constitutionalize inequality. Right, because we internationalize the state, we create the WTO, we create balanced budget amendments at the European supranational level. We declare central banks to be independent of parliaments, and that way, the decisions that really matter, where it's about the economic affairs, where people are really affected, can no longer be decided about by people to vote. And in that way, the capitalist class basically went back to Lenin by acknowledging that, if you can offset disaffection and disappointment with a non-functioning, dysfunctional system, and we do have dysfunctional systems, liberal democracy is failing the Western capitalist classes' populations, then we can always direct it against the ruling party to the benefit of a new party that runs the government without having anything to decide.
On the question of liberalism and democracy, I think for me, my understanding of liberalism is that it is the ideology of the kind of ascendant bourgeoisie in the epoch of its revolutions, but it is always contains a kind of, it has kind of two sides. There's kind of an anti-democratic and a democratic element. And that is always in tension in that period, which represents the contradictions of the bourgeois revolution. I think at its apogee, when capitalism truly triumphs over the world, and you have, I think in the context of the Cold War in particular, liberalism evacuates itself of much of its radical content in order to win the Cold War. Like, in order to win the Cold War, liberalism evacuated itself of sort of its commitments to egalitarianism, etc. And today, liberalism is essentially a hollow political system which defends nothing except the most crass bourgeois rule and a kind of gestural kind of social liberalism, which derives from like the kind of Rawls sort of world and that sort of thing. I think that this today is totally hollow and empty. So liberalism, is it revolutionary, counter-revolutionary? Well, the answer is it's dialectical, comrades. I think on democracy, and this is very important, the answer is, can capitalism rule through democratic forms? The answer is, once again, yes and no. But I think at a fundamental level, capitalist society is a minoritarian order. It is an order that enshrines the rule of a minority ruling class. By its nature, a democratic order, i.e. a maximally democratic order where the majority has absolute political power, is, I think, at a fundamental level incompatible with capitalist rule. However, and it is for this reason that in every capitalist state today, you will find limitations on democracy. Be it here, we have, the anti-democratic Senate, the Supreme Court, and its capacity to overturn legislation, and the imperial bureaucracy and presidency. Be it in Europe, you have, the supranational economic institutions, the World Bank and the World Trade Organization, the European Commission. In Australia and the other Commonwealth countries, we have these inheritances of the British Westminster system, where you have anti-democratic forms of, in Australia we still have, at the local level, the property franchise, where outside of my own state of Queensland, where it was abolished by the Labour Party in the 1920s, the rest of the country, businesses have the right to vote in elections at the local level. All these, I know it's absurd. This is, you have these anti-democratic limits on the power of working people. This is a necessary precondition to defend the power of the capitalist class. However, in the context of an anti-democratic structure like that, democratic mechanisms can become, as Engels describes it, a tool of illusion, or a tool of deception of the working class, and serves a role in the historic process of the integration of the working class into bourgeois culture, which has been, I would argue, a reactionary integration, an integration on a reactionary basis, which has led to, in fact, the imprisonment of working people in a kind of bourgeois welfarist arrangement. We've got to already talk about this, but yeah, that's my thoughts.
All right, let me throw a wrench into the works. It's my role here. Didn't Marx and Engels say to their followers in Germany, if you have to prioritize something, it should be the right to speech and association and not the franchise? He did. They did. And as far as separation of powers is concerned, and whether the French Revolution was an advance over the American Revolution, a unicameral legislature with a parliamentary system, a kind of majoritarian system. Again, what's the point of having a constitution if you don't have a body that can rule that a law passed by the majority is unconstitutional, namely against the rights of the minority or of the individual against the state? And wouldn't socialists need that? Wouldn't socialists have to be able to appeal to the Supreme Court to defend their liberty against the state, even when that state is expressing the majority will. And indeed, in the United States, we have the famous right to speech except yelling fire in a crowded theater. Very few people know what that case referred to. That referred to the Socialist Party objecting to World War I. In other words, it was anti-war agitation that was analogized to yelling fire in a crowded theater. And in fact, the Supreme Court, that case is completely misremembered. No, it was upheld that ultimately it was upheld that they could. Meaning this is a strangely misremembered history. Because building a socialist movement, the majority is going to be against you. The majority is going to be against you. There's no way around it. Where we are at now, building a socialist movement, the majority is going to be against you. And it will be a matter of fighting for civil liberties. Here's another seldom known fact: the ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union. Who established it? The Socialists. The Socialist Party. Also, by the way, Socialists established the NAACP back in the day. But in the meantime, what have these organizations become? They've become NGO organizations associated with the Democratic Party. And that brings me back to the new social movements and the minorities and women, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's another thing that's killed the left since the 1960s. Meaning any attempt to establish a socialist movement is immediately subjected to the imperative that it model itself on the constituency caucus structure of the Democratic Party. And as soon as it doesn't, then it's canceled. All right, so we've seen it in the DSA, and it, so very clearly, and in the name of democracy and equitable representation, the socialist movement is killed before it even gets started. Finally, since I brought up representation, I want to point out that the Soviet system, workers' councils, and the conception of even the dictatorship of the proletariat by the Second International and also by the Third International, it's not direct democracy. It is representational democracy. It's representative, and it's also mediated by parties, both of which violate the notion of direct democracy. And of course, parties depend on civil liberties. In other words, you can't really have parties unless you have civil liberties against the state and against the majority. You can't have that. My example on this is an article that I wrote like 15 years ago on Lenin's liberalism. Why did Lenin defend the independence of labor unions in the trade union dispute in 1920 when Trotsky wanted to militarize labor and basically make the unions an extension of the state? Because even though it was a state ruled by Bolsheviks, communists, and a working class party, Lenin said, no, the workers need to be able to defend their interests against us. What did he mean by that? Civil liberties. The working class needed civil liberties. Okay, so again, we're back to square one. Meaning, if we adopt a majoritarian democratic criterion and desideratum, you'll kill the socialist movement before it even gets started. You'll kill the dictatorship of the proletariat, if we ever get there.
Oh my goodness, so many hands. Okay, we're going to go with Connor.
I want to raise the conversation to the prospects of socialism in America today. I think you're all, in your own ways, responding to sort of the failure of socialism in America with the millennial left, particularly the Sanders movement. So this is a question to all three of you. There seems to be agreement that the American Revolution is key to the world revolution. And beyond that, there seems to be agreement that this revolution depends upon a party. In fact, there seems to be an almost consensus, or an emerging consensus, yet no such party exists. Why is this, and by what means can this situation be overcome?
Can you take it?
Edith, that's for you.
Well, I mean, I'm not an American, and I don't really believe in going around telling people what to do. So,
You know you want to.
I think that, so I guess the question is like, why has a party failed to emerge, and then how can that be overcome, right? Yeah, okay. Well, I think the why is probably an interesting historical question. I think I keep talking about this idea of sedimented failures, that each failure reinforces and makes more difficult these accumulate, right? It's not just like, oh, we failed, but we'll, no, the accumulated failures, they like pile up on top of each other. This enormous mountain, this colossal wreck that we confront. I think that the American left is probably almost archetypical of this. Each successive wave where an opportunity was posed for a formation of an independent workers' party, be it in the 1870s, the St. Louis kind of rising, etc. Be it in the Socialist Party, be it in the CIO and the sort of reintegration of the CIO into the Democratic Party apparatus. At each and every one of these turns, the American socialist movement has failed decisively at the sort of brink to make the leap. And there's, I think, material reasons for this. Mike Davis's book on this is very good in my opinion. In terms of, which means that any ability to kind of to break out of this cycle, this negative dialectic of defeat and despair, requires a total assessment of these failures and a total recalibration of the project. That's obviously true. Where to go from here? I think that the fundamental task remains the regroupment of revolutionary forces and the fusion of those forces with the most advanced layers of workers. That remains the elementary calculation. The exact details of that, I think, will be different in different countries, but it still remains our objective task. In America, I think today you have, emerging sort of socialist layers. You have the inheritors of the old sectarian traditions. You have these layers around the democratic socialists of America. And you have, various sort of popular movements that kind of emerge, and then are kind of integrated back into the Democratic Party. I think that the need to kind of draw those three forces together and undertake a genuine reevaluation and regroupment effort of those forces is the necessary path to an American party. However, I think that this is going to have to be in dialogue and in a dialectical relationship with the re-emergence of revolutionary Marxism in the entire hemisphere. A point of my talk that I feel has not been taken up much is that I do think that the Third American Revolution is a hemispheric revolution. It is not just within the borders of these United States.
Right.
It is a hemispheric revolution. And that means that, between the United States and Brazil, you have essentially the entire linchpin of the continent. It just runs through that.
Sure.
And and Trotsky himself said this
Sure.
when discussing the dynamics of the American Revolution. It is as much as in Chicago, as in CDMX, and in Rio, that the fate of this American Revolution will be decided. And I think that American Marxists need to take their internationalist duty far more seriously than they currently do.
Yeah.
I think the American left has been very derelict in this internationalist duty. And the sort of negative reflection of this has been a kind of third worldist, like, that actually the American working class has no obligation because we're all fucked, and so we just have to go and hold signs or whatever. No. American workers, the American socialists have an obligation, and they have the resources to fight. Che Guevara said, he envies those who live within the belly of the beast, because that is where the world revolution will run through. And I think that remains true today. I think that the task of the American socialists is to actually build something that their comrades in Latin America
Can take inspiration.
can take inspiration from, and vice versa.
Yes.
Because otherwise, the American exceptionalism that has plagued the American left, where the American left looks only to itself for its own destiny, will condemn it forever. I think that is the task that our American comrades face. Once again, I can't tell you what to do, but I think you should probably take it into consideration.
Criteria.
I think the socialist movement is always strongest where it indigenizes. And so socialism will come in very different forms across different countries. And that's something that really unites very divergent Marxist traditions from Gramsci via Otto Bauer to Mao Zedong. Like that they all understood it will have to be an inherently American socialism based in the American tradition, just like it had to be an Italian socialism or a specifically Chinese socialism. I think, though, if we wonder why socialism did not thrive as a movement in those countries where the economic conditions seemed to be ripe, right? Where the working class became, because of industrialization, the majority class, a majoritarian class, but rather evolutionary socialist ideas could prevail, like especially in the Anglo-Saxon world, right? In Britain with the Fabians, but also with New Deal liberalism, etc. Which there is something to be said about New Deal liberalism. I come from fascism, I come from Germany, where the exit, where the exit strategy from the crisis of the 30s was the opposite to what Roosevelt did, right? It was crushing the labor movement instead of the Wagner Act empowering the labor movement, etc., etc. So, but still, so that's something that we have to come to terms with. What I find interesting is that the world historical moment, like the reason why the working class could be co-opted was because there was much to redistribute in the core capitalist countries. But it's no longer. And we're in a situation where the questions that you, in my view, juxtapose too much, like the question of liberalism or liberal civic freedoms as opposed to material gains, they are now being, like there's a structural convergence of those issues.
Sure.
Because the West is losing the battle in the hyper-competitiveness against China and the global South. And as a result, Bidenomics failed, not to the degree that Next Generation EU failed, not to the degree that the German, Ampel,
Miracle.
Progressive Coalition, Olaf Scholz and the Greens and the Free Democrats. But all of them are asking themselves, like, why did it fail that we try to emulate Chinese industrial policy? Because that was what Bidenomics and Next Generation EU was. And one reason why it failed was because of the dysfunctionality of liberal democracy. So we have an erosion in the faith of liberal democracy, both from above as well as below, right? And so we do, and basically we are in an anti-systemic moment. Because it's totally clear that none of the issues that we have in the current systemic crisis, like the climate issue, the social labor issue, the democratic issue, or the gender issue, can be resolved under the current system. Right? It's totally clear that the militarism that we're seeing is going to really have a terrible impact on the working class. It already has. Right? And it's also clear that in a bloc confrontation against China and the global South, climate justice is going to be thrown under the bus. Right? So, and in my view, the question would be, how can we translate that structural convergence of the labor issue, of the climate issue, of the gender issue, and the democracy issue into a movement that is anti-systemic in nature? And there, I presume, we will have a lot of we will make a lot of errors because we also are in a novel situation that we've never faced before. The working class is not a as I said earlier, is not an upcoming, upsurging movement, but we need to rebuild it at the same time. What I found interesting about America, since you were saying that, you know, America's internationalism, like, despite the fact that if you look at the Gallup polls, like, you know, the way the world views America, nonetheless, you're still the country of the lingua franca, and like every German knows more about the United States than about the Dutch, than about the Belgians, the Danish, or the Poles, or the Italians, or the Austrians, right? So, like, what happens here has a tremendous effect, and so did the Sanders movement, right? Like, we were in the midst, like, of the crisis of the European left as a result of the strangulation of Syriza, and this was giving people hope. And so, and obviously this inverted Gramscianism, right, that I think that Sanders was basically, right, we invoke the working class from above and hope that it will, you know, then organize itself from below. I mean, it did work with Walmart, and like I appreciate the strikes that you had in the biggest, you know, employers like Walmart and Amazon here, very important. But obviously there's limits to that strategy too. But I think in the future we will make many errors, but as Mao said, the truth is in practice, right? That's the measure, and we will have to make mistakes in order to learn how to do things better.
I kind of have something to respond to, if that's okay.
Go for it.
Yeah, I have a few things to respond to there, because I've followed you so far, and I disagree with quite a few things you said. I think this question of the indigenization of socialism, I think that the 20th century shows us the exact limits of an American road, or an Italian road, or a Chinese road to socialism. The crisis in the Middle East today is in many ways the failure of the national road to socialism.
Absolutely. Yeah.
You know, if the crisis in the Mashrek is a failure of the national road to socialism. The failure of the Latin American left is absolutely the failure of the national road to socialism. The idea that socialism we realize in Cuba or Colombia or Mexico alone, rather than as a continental revolution, is exactly the failure of the national road to socialism.
It's not necessarily the same, though, I would say.
I do think that is the direction this leads to. Okay. I think that on the comment about FDR, I would argue that the reintegration of the working class into the state through a corporatist mass movement is exactly the correlate between FDR and fascism in Europe. And I think that, you know, FDR's own economic policy was inspired by Mussolini, right? It is, in fact, and I've said that I think FDR is America's most fascist president. You know,
makes a difference if you're sitting in a concentration camp or in a union, right?
Well, but I mean, what if you're Japanese? Like, I mean, America had concentration camps for Japanese people during the war. Like, I think that, and it is exactly the integration of the working class into the state that was the historical defeat of the American working class with the CIO. It is exactly what exposed the trade union movement to a McCarthyism with these state unions where the state could just purge these communists. I think that it is, I do agree with you today that, you know, the ruling class has lost its faith in democracy. The masses cry out for a Bonaparte. Who defends democracy today? We do. That's my answer.
Yes.
Like, I think that we must be the most ardent and consistent Democrats. And that is, I think that is something that the socialist movement as a whole has lost. It is, a good comrade of mine in Poland once put this to me in these terms. Marx and Engels' historical project was to convince the Republican revolutionaries of their day that they must take up the social question.
Right.
Today, we have a left that is fixated on the social question, and we must convince them to take up the radical Republican political question, to take up the question of democracy. So that's my take on this.
Ingar, do you want to respond to that? Or
No, that's good.
No,
There's so many
okay,
people.
I think we're going to take a... Oh, did you want to say something, Chris? Okay, then why don't we take a few, because we're getting kind of close to time. So we're going to start here with Kay, and then Alan, and then I'll take some more also after they go, okay? So be ready to raise your hands again.
Hello, and thank you. So, Bonaparte was just mentioned, and there's one thing that didn't come up yet, I'm a bit surprised about, which is the question of Trump. Trump. What is the relationship of Trump to the American Revolution? Is he the inheritor of the American Revolution? Is it the counter-revolution? What is the relationship of the working class to Trump? What is the relationship of socialism to Trump? What does it mean for workers, the working class, which everyone talk about is that workers got Trump elected and so on. What does that mean? What can we learn from that for socialism?
I think we should let this question stand on its own, and then we'll take a group. Do you guys want to respond to this?
Okay, so because I've, stepped out on a limb 10 years ago with my crazy "Why Not Trump" article, I feel like I have to sort of address this. So first of all, no, I think that the last 10 plus years, since 2015, 2016, the mainstream political discourse has been agonized over this populism question, left populism, right populism. Sanders, Trump, crossover voters between Sanders and Trump, the working class vote, the swing vote. It used to be called the Reagan Democrats, right? So the Democrat working class vote that Reagan won and that Clinton won back and that George W. Bush won after 9/11 and Obama won back and then Trump won yet again. So first of all, of course, the working class is disproportionately not represented in the electorate. So both parties are interested in not having the working class vote. And I don't think that Trump really represented any kind of substantial change with respect to that. However, he was vilified by both Republicans and Democrats for reaching to any extent into the working class with an appeal, because they regarded it as dangerous demagogy, and because neither party wants to depend on a working class constituency. They don't want to do anything to maintain that constituency in the neoliberal era. Right, so this is very different from the pre-neoliberal era. So I think that now, on the other hand, you'll also get in the mainstream capitalist political discourse kind of strange interpretations of class. So the uneducated versus the educated, right? So Trump won the uneducated vote, and the Democrats won the educated vote. Which is a bizarre way of thinking about class, but nonetheless, there it is. And clearly, the millennial left moment, insofar as it did fold into the Democratic Party readily, it was, of course, disproportionately representing educated and not uneducated people in terms of higher education. So there is this kind of specter. Now, there are people who wanted Trump to be a Bonaparte. But Trump himself, much less so. Meaning, if we look at Curtis Yarvin, these kinds of, the millennial right was also here, and also the Gen X right, and of course there's a Zoomer right. So there's Curtis Yarvin, and there's Richard Spencer, and there's Nick Fuentes. It spans the generations. There was a millennial right for sure, but the millennial left was perhaps more prominent. And like I said, Curtis Yarvin is my generation. So there is this kind of toying with the idea of Bonapartism, of some kind of monarchism, etc. But I think that Trump himself doesn't necessarily represent that. I think that that's a kind of, maybe Steve Bannon has some impulses in that direction, although I think it would be hard to square Steve Bannon even in that direction, because he was more of a Tea Party kind of libertarian kind of Republican. So I don't think that we're there yet. Obviously, when the Democrats call Trump a fascist, they've been calling every Republican presidential candidate since Thomas Dewey in 1948, and even before that, a fascist. Right? Now, the left tends to just take up what the Democrats say and treat it in a kind of hysteric, literal way, meaning the Democrats know that they're engaged in a figure of speech, whereas the left are oh, scientifically, let's analyze fascism. Let's define, what is the Marxist definition of fascism? And turns out Trump fits it to a T. It's a stressor-eyed fascism, don't you know? I don't think so. At the same time, it's clear that there has been a crisis in the parties. So I would say it's drastic to say that the ruling class has lost faith in democracy. I think the ruling class has perhaps lost faith in its parties, and that's more a problem of the parties than it is of the ruling class. I think the ruling class would love to have two functional parties, and they don't, and they haven't, since basically Obama kept the appearance of it, and then since Obama, it's fallen apart. And so I think that, to say, well, the ruling class is ready to overthrow democracy, well, sure, if democracy is abandoned by the parties, in other words, if the parties don't serve, then of course the ruling class will find some way of intervening. But they'd prefer to intervene through the parties. And I think that what you see is rather a scramble, not to overthrow democracy, but a scramble to somehow firm up the parties. And that just raises the question of a socialist party. And so finally, on the Republican question, since Edith, you brought that up, on the small r Republican question, because the millennials have landed on this kind of Marx was a Republican. Marx wasn't a liberal, he was a Republican. Yeah, I don't think so. Meaning, I think that the problem of a socialist party can't jump to the question of the Republic or the Democratic Republic immediately. I think that first the party would actually have to be based in society. You'd need an actual social movement to motivate the creation of a new political party that would indeed point to the limitations of the existing political order. Meaning socialist parties, whether the Socialist Party of America, Eugene Debs, any of the socialist parties, the French Socialist Party of Jean Jaurès, certainly the SPD in Germany, for other reasons perhaps, the existence of that party challenged the political order in and of itself, presented a crisis of the political order. So in the United States, they would routinely disqualify Socialist Party candidates on the basis that they were not really political parties because they were membership organizations, meaning that the Socialist Party was understood as a membership organization and not a political party, meant that they could be disqualified as a legitimate political party for electoral contests, because the idea was that a socialist representative in a state assembly or Congress would not answer to their constituency that elected them, but would answer to the party. And again, that raises the question not just of the constitutional political order, but the question of, well, how do we understand civil social organizations and right to association? Meaning, why shouldn't a representative in a legislative body also answer to a national party and not just to their local constituents? Like, in other words, what is the problem with that? Because again, in representative democracy, it's not immediate recall, meaning it's delegated authority, it's representational, meaning you are choosing a party to represent you, not just an individual electoral candidate to represent you. So it raises all of those questions, which I don't think can be settled simply via republicanism. I don't think that it's a simple matter of republicanism or of the legal juridical order per se, but also it raises questions of civil social freedom and what social organizations independent of the state, what the scope of their liberty amounts to for a socialist movement. I mean, we know what that means in terms of capitalist corporations, but in terms of a socialist movement. We'll also say about labor unions, because we've danced around that issue too. Labor unions, in many countries, labor unions derive their legitimacy from the state. Is that a good idea? Right, so there's the Wagner Act on the one hand, and there's also Taft-Hartley on the other hand. Right, so they kind of bookend the phenomenon from the 30s into the late 40s. It's not as if, oh, Wagner Act is good, Taft-Hartley Act is bad. It's all of a piece. And if you say labor unions are only legitimate if the state recognizes them, that's a huge concession. That's a huge concession. And I do think today the labor movement itself would have to be reconstituted fundamentally from below. In other words, we can't take the existing labor unions and say these are fit for purpose. They certainly aren't fit for purpose for a socialist movement. They're not even fit for purpose for collective bargaining. They're not. We have to acknowledge that.
Look, I'm not. The question about the relationship between Trump and the American Revolution, I have no idea. I'm not going to try to answer that. What I'll say is that I think that, I mean, if you want to hear me talk about Bonapartism, I'll be talking about Bonapartism tomorrow on the panel, so I'm not going to comment on it now. What I will say, though, is that, you know, I agree about this question of the labour unions and this question of depoliticization of workers. If you want to look at a country where the ruling powers do have to win the consent of workers, I mean, Australia is a good example. We have compulsory voting. We have 99% turnout or something. Every election is decided by the working class, and that means that the Labour Party more or less kind of wins default. That's not necessarily true. The Liberal, but every other party of the right needs to be in coalition to defeat the Labour Party. So when we're not ruled by the Labour Party, we're ruled by a coalition of the liberal bourgeoisie and the agrarian bourgeoisie in the Liberal National Coalition. And at the moment, that coalition is breaking down, which means that the Labour Party kind of rules uncontested. You have One Nation, which is an attempt to revive a right populism, but it's not working. I agree. I think that on the question of I will say about Trump and Bonapartism, though, I think that it's quite clear at this point that Trumpism has failed. Trump has been this attempt. I think there was an attempt to turn Trump into an American Bonaparte. I think I talk about this in my idea, Marx talking about Trump as the American Sulla, this sort of thing, is but this failed. Trump's domestic policy is in shambles. His international policy, I know they'll go parading around saying that they've won a great victory in Iran. It's humiliating. This is a humiliation. The Republic is still there. And now the Americans are crying out because the price of oil has gone up too high. This is a humiliation. The Trump administration has been a colossal failure. And I think that is going to cause consternation on the right. And maybe out of that we might see an American fascism. Out of that kind of the rethinking that will happen on the American right after this. I've already seen what was his name? Dan Bovino.
Oh, Dan Bovino, yeah.
Yeah, saying that I had a plan to deport 100 million people, but they wouldn't let me do it. This is kind of, I think, where the American right or sections of it are going. But that's their question to figure out, not ours. I think for us, I think that we often have this problem in the Australian left, where the left is constantly talking about fighting the right. We need to fight the right, we need to fight the right. We need to organise to fight the right. We go out in the streets to fight the right. We have to organise to defeat the right in the next elections. But the reality is that you can defeat the right, but you'll still remain with a dictatorship of capital.
Yeah.
The struggle of socialism is not a struggle against the right.
Right.
It is a struggle against the capitalist ruling class. But it is necessary to defeat the right politically in order to accomplish that. That is instrumental.
Is that the principle?
Exactly. The principle is to defeat the capitalist ruling class, not to defeat the right.
Right.
And that is not me making some argument for some left-right neo-fusionist thing. Of course, we need to have a clear heads about this. But it is the fundamental fact is that I think many on the left because the struggle against capital is too hard, frankly, and it's depressing, it's miserable to see how weak we are, to basically transform that into a struggle against the right. The biggest task on the left today is to defeat right-wing populism. But the biggest task on the left today is to defeat the capitalist class. Sometimes they will rely on right-wing populism to achieve their goals, or factions of them will. But what it ends up doing is it ends up being a form of passive, kind of a quiet popular front, where we join forces with the liberals in order to defeat the right. But we cannot position ourselves as defenders of a corroded, decadent, bourgeois liberal order. That is what I think the left has been doing in certain parts of the world, and it has been a historic failure. We need to get away from that. We are not defenders of this order from the right. We defend our democratic liberties, of course, but we still must maintain our principled political independence. And I feel that this, like, we need to fight the right, and the Trump fixation, etc., grows out of this. And God, I mean, you see this in Australia. Trump isn't even our president. We don't even have a president. and people are talking about, oh, what about Trumpism? What about this? We have an actual prime minister who is putting trade unions under state administration, who is supporting the Americans' war abroad, who is doing all these things at home. And many Australian leftists are more interested in talking about what's happening in the White House, which we have very little influence over, than they are with talking about what's happening in Canberra, what's happening in Brisbane, Sydney, and Melbourne. And I think that is something that we need to get over. You know.
Well, in 2018, we published a book which is called The New Bonapartists, like on the various right-wing forces and government takeovers, because I mean we were in the fortunate situation or unfortunate situation that we could try and analyze what the right does when it has power. Like you know the book, What Does the Ruling Class Do When It Rules? So what does the right do when it has power? And I wrote the chapter on Trump, trying to understand, like to see whether Marx's theory of Bonapartism was actually still, could explain Trumpism. And I think that, I mean, if in a nutshell, Marx's theory of Bonapartism is based on an equilibrium theory, like not a hierarchian one, but like one that basically the bourgeoisie gives up on direct rule because it's like there's an equilibrium of capital and labor, right? And if you look at like the United States situation, obviously that was like you could not uphold that argument, right? I operationalized it with three elements, like the level of labor disputes, unionization rate, and the wage quota, basically the real wage development. And so obviously that it was impossible to use Marx's Bonapartism thesis to explain Donald Trump. But I do think that there's a case to be made for Nikos Poulantzas' theory of fascism, which basically, even though he was a Maoist, draws a lot on Trotsky's theory of fascism. Basically fascism as a vacuum, right? That in a situation where the situation has become so dire and untenable, but socialist alternatives are too weak, that then the middle classes that could turn to the left when they see it as like a source of optimism, as a source of alleviating its pain, that they turn to the right when in a situation where there is no left socialist alternative, and then hauling a lot of the workers with them. And I agree with you that like the right-wing populism or right-wing authoritarian nationalism, as I call it, is a middle-class movement. Yeah. It's a petty bourgeois movement that but then has a moment of proletarianization of its base, which then obviously causes a lot of problems also in Make America Great Again. What I find interesting is that right-wing authoritarian nationalism is dysfunctional or was dysfunctional in a global capitalist society. Take European right-wing populists, for instance. Like if they were against the euro and against NATO. So they were basically against like the stepping stone for transnational corporations into the world market, right? And they were against the military that enforces foreign direct investments in global capitalism. So obviously they could not be an ally of the dominant faction of the capitalist class, namely transnational capital. And it has to do with the problem of the parties, I would agree. But in the sense, as Habermas pointed it out, like the problem of capitalist systemic crises is they necessitate a unified capitalist class, like a unified bourgeoisie, but the nature of a systemic crisis is that it fragments the capitalist class. So like that's how a crisis also becomes pervasive, because the state cannot manage that crisis no longer. And what we see now, I think, is that the right-wing authoritarian nationalists become functional to the capitalist class. in a situation where there is also a passive revolution in a Gramscian sense internationally, right? China is making, because it's hyper-competitive, is making the West authoritarian because the West can only compete with strong executive power. And that means that also, I agree with Comrade Edith here, like fighting the right is a really terrible strategy if what is right comes from the center itself, right? If like the liberals themselves have to become more authoritarian to compete on behalf of the bourgeoisie with China and the global South. And so I do think, I agree, we have the same argument in Europe, like that we need to have a third pole, like beyond both the more increasingly authoritarian liberal center as well as the far right, because otherwise it's only going to strengthen the far right because we become part of like in a very terrible popular frontist cliche part of a failing system.
One more spoke in the wheel. So on the Bonapartism question, which you guys will talk about tomorrow, hyper-compressed concept in Marx, meaning post-1848, post-June days, suppression of the working class struggles in France. What do class struggles look like when the proletariat isn't present, isn't in the mix? So when the bourgeoisie can no longer rule in the old way, but the proletariat cannot yet rule. Well, the bourgeoisie has not been able to rule in the old way for a very long time, meaning bourgeoisie used to rule socially rather than politically, meaning there was a more minimal state. So we earlier in the conversation talked about, because I think the question of Bonapartism really raises other questions, the administrative state. Woodrow Wilson, The New Freedom. Where did he get his inspiration from? Bismarck. And what did he say? He said we have to pay lip service to the US Constitution, but we're not actually doing it. And we need a fourth branch of government because liberal democracy can't rule industrial capitalism. So what can rule industrial capitalism? The deep state. And really, the crisis of democracy that has taken form, whether in Europe or the United States, in terms of the failure of the parties, is that it has created an opening for people to take democracy too seriously. Meaning, who does have the authority? Does Trump, as elected civilian politician, have the authority? Or do the bureaucrats have the authority? Because they've tried to sabotage him every step of the way. Including, perhaps, in this current war with Iran, meaning it seems like less clear than in the first term that the bureaucracy is there as an impediment. But nonetheless, it raises the question of, is the proper role of the parties to exchange empty suits and to guarantee continuity of policy through the deep state? I always like to invoke Samantha Power, who was the national security advisor for Obama, when Obama was supposedly going to end the war on terror. And what did she say? She said, we soon learned the wisdom of continuity in American foreign policy. And she said, I'm afraid that Trump is incapable of learning that wisdom, meaning he will actually try to change the policy. Whereas what we learned is you might want to change the policy, but you can't. Right? It's too dangerous. It's too destabilizing for the world, essentially. It's too destabilizing for the role that the US plays. So we are having an experiment in democracy right now, meaning the people elected this guy. Does he know what he's doing? Has he been vetted properly? Does he read the intelligence briefings? Does that matter? In other words, is he just supposed to? So we're in the midst of this war with Iran right now. We meaning all of us living in this historical moment, because I don't refer to U.S. policy in terms of we, not at all. Soleimani. So you could say this tête-à-tête with Trump and Iran goes back to the assassination of Soleimani. Literally, what happened? The national security agencies developed a menu of options, And they did so in a way to try to coerce him into taking one action rather than another action. So they put the killing of Soleimani on there as like the crazy option that of course he would never take. And he said he knew that they had put it on the menu as the option he's not supposed to take, and that's why he took it. Now, of course, we can be appalled and horrified by that, but the alternative to that is unelected rule. And that's the real Bonapartism. That's the real Bonapartism. As Marx pointed out, it wasn't Louis Bonaparte, actually, because he was not like Napoleon. It was the state. It was the state that he represented. And he himself was a kind of mediocrity and incapable of playing a world historic role, but the state that he represented was the necessary instrument to maintain capitalism. And we're testing the limits of that, meaning, is this a liberal democracy or is it a bureaucratic dictatorship? It's a bureaucratic dictatorship, but with the illusion of democracy, including the illusion that the president can make the decisions. That can't be left out of the equation. It can't be left out of the equation. Meaning, of course, Trump was never meant to be president because he doesn't know enough to know that you're supposed to listen to the bureaucrats.
Okay, I've been told that 8 p.m. is actually a hard cutoff, so we're at time. So thank you to everybody.